Hello guys, welcome to Phoenix What If. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto became Rukia's partner in the 13th division and they fell in love? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Golden Anomaly. The dust of the 78th district of the Rukongai, Junrinan, tasted of despair. It was a fine, gray powder that coated the tongue, the back of the throat, and settled deep in the soul. 4. The woman clutching her child in the shadow of a leaning shack, it was the taste of an ending. The things that hunted them were not born of this world. They were amalgamations of hunger and regret, owering monsters with bone-white masks and gaping maws where their hearts should have been. Hollows. 3 of them. They had her and the boy cornered, their guttural snarls echoing in the narrow alley, a sound that promised not just death, but consumption. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her son's head tight against her chest, trying to shield him from the inevitable. She prayed to gods she no longer believed in, to Shinigami who never seemed to come this far out. Then, a change. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A sudden, inexplicable warmth, like the first sunbeam after a long winter, pressed against her back. The air, once thick with the cloying stench of the hollows, now smelled faintly of ozone and summer fields. The monstrous snarling faltered, replaced by confused, agitated hisses. Hesitantly, she cracked open an eye. A man stood at the mouth of the alley. He wasn't a Shinigami. He wore no black shihakusho, carried no blade. He was dressed in simple, worn traveling clothes. A faded orange jacket over a black shirt, dark pants. His hair was a startling shock of sun-bright yellow, and though his face was lined with the faint etchings of age and experience, his eyes, a deep and impossible blue, held a youthful clarity. He looked lost, but not afraid. Merely observant. The hollows had forgotten her. All 3 turned to face the newcomer, their predatory instincts screaming at the sheer density of the soul that had just appeared. It was not a meal, it was a feast. It was a banquet laid out in the middle of a famine. One of them, a creature with the body of a praying mantis and a cracked hyena mask, let out a piercing shriek and lunged. The man didn't move, he simply watched it come. And then, the impossible happened. As the hollow entered the perimeter of that gentle warmth radiating from him, its form began to dissolve. Not in a burst of blood or an explosion of energy, but like sugar in hot water. The edges of its monstrous form shimmered, turning into golden motes of light that flaked away into the air. Its lunge slowed, its shriek turning into a sound of pained confusion as its own spiritual matter was unmade by the mere proximity of the man's presence. By the time its claws were within a foot of his face, its entire arm had vanished into a glittering cascade of golden dust. It stumbled, tried to pull back, but it was too late. The light, the warmth, the sheer pressure of his existence washed over it, and in a silent, beautiful cascade, the creature completely disintegrated, leaving nothing behind but a lingering, pleasant warmth. The other 2 hollows froze. The raw, primal hunger that drove them was being overwhelmed by an even more primal instinct, self-preservation. This was not prey. This was a predator of a different, higher order. They began to back away, their massive forms scraping against the wooden hovels. The man finally spoke, his voice calm and even, carrying a strange resonance. You should go. The hollows didn't need to be told twice. They turned and fled, their clumsy retreat kicking up clouds of gray dust. The alley fell silent, save for the whimpering of the child. The man's blue eyes finally settled on the woman and her son. The oppressive, overwhelming power that had just unmade a monster receded, banked like a furnace, leaving only the gentle warmth. He offered a small, reassuring smile. You 2 all right? The woman could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. He looked around at the dilapidated surroundings, a flicker of something, sadness, maybe memory, in his gaze. He took a half-step forward, then stopped as a new sound cut through the air. A sharp, high-pitched whistle. From the rooftops, 3 figures in black landed silently in the street. Shinigami. Their leader, a man with a severe topknot and the insignia of the 4th Division on his arm, had his hand on the hilt of his katana, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the spot where the hollow had been. The spiritual residue wasn't that of a battle, it was pure Clean. Like the area had been consecrated. His gaze snapped to the man in the orange jacket. The Shinigami's training screamed at him. The spiritual pressure ling off this single soul was greater than any captain's he had ever felt. It wasn't jagged and violent like Captain Zaraki's, or cold and immense like Captain Commander Yamamoto's. It was like standing in the direct path of a solar flare, blinding, absolute, and yet, somehow, not malicious. It was simply, there. A fact of nature. Identify yourself, plus, the Shinigami commanded, his voice tight. He was trying to sound authoritative, but a tremor of awe and fear ran through it. The blonde man, Naruto Uzumaki, looked from the terrified woman back to the tense Shinigami. He had died, he was sure of it. An old man, surrounded by his family, his village safe, his long life of chaos finally settled into a peaceful twilight. He'd closed his eyes, and then he had opened them here, in this dusty, desperate place. Kurama had been quiet, a slumbering presence fused so deeply into his soul that they were one and the same, the source of this warmth that seemed to react so violently to the masked creatures. He raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. He was a leader, a Hokage. He knew how to de-escalate. No trouble, Naruto said, his voice carrying easily down the alley. My name is Naruto Uzumaki. I think I might be new here. The air in the 1st Division Assembly Hall was always heavy with the weight of centuries. Today, it was electric. The captains of the Gote 13 stood in their twin lines. Their faces a gallery of stoicism, curiosity, and outright alarm. At the head of the room, behind a thin screen, sat the captain commander, Genryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto. His eyes were closed, but every person in the room knew he was more aware than all of them combined. The report from the 4th Division is conclusive, Captain Retsu Unohana said, her serene voice cutting through the tension. A plus soul of immeasurable spiritual density appeared in the 78th district an hour ago. The subject is a male, appearing to be in his late prime, and by all accounts, he passive. Ely erased 3 standard hollows simply by being near them. A low, guttural chuckle rumbled from the hulking form of Kenpachi Zaraki. A manic grin stretched across his scarred face. Passively erased. Don't be boring, Unohana. He fought him. I can feel it from here. It's like a damn sun just lit up in the Rukongai. He's strong. On his shoulder, the tiny pink-haired form of Yakiru Kusajishi giggled. Kenny's all excited. Strength is not the question. Captain Zaraki, Captain Soy Fawn of the 2nd Division snapped, her small frame rigid with suspicion. The question is control, and origin. An unseated soul with this level of power is an unprecedented security threat. He should be detained by the Onmitsukido and interrogated immediately. Oh, I do hope you'll let me assist with that, a silken, unnerving voice slid into the conversation. Captain Mayuri Kuratsuchi, his face a grotesque mask of black and white paint, leered. An entity capable of deconstructing spiritual matter on Kanta. Court. The research possibilities are simply exquisite. I must have him. His anatomy, his soul structure. I'll need at least a week to get a preliminary dissection done. Captain Toshiro Hitsugaya, the young prodigy of the 10th Division, scowled. Can we be serious? The readings from the spiritual pressure measurement unit are nonsensical. They fluctuate, but the baseline is higher than any recorded energy signature in the Seraite's history. It defies all known laws of soul dynamics. Perhaps it is not a soul as we know it, a new voice stated. It was measured, calm, and carried an academic chill. Captain Kajiyasu Fumihiro of the 9th Division, a man recently promoted to fill the void left by Konami Tosen, stepped forward slightly. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp features and dark hair meticulously combed. His uniform was immaculate. The balance of the 3 worlds is a delicate, mathematical certainty. Souls flow, hollows consume, Shinigami purify. It is a perfect, cyclical equation. This anomaly is a variable for which there is no account. His very existence is a disruption. A foreign body that the world itself may seek to reject in catastrophic ways. His logic was cold and sharp, silencing the more visceral reactions of Kenpachi and Mayuri. He was not appealing to fear of the unknown, but to fear of upsetting a known, fragile order. What are you suggesting, Captain Kajiyasu? Shunsui Kiyaraku asked, the brim of his straw hat shadowing his eyes. He seemed relaxed, but his posture had a coiled readiness. "I am suggesting prudence," Kujiyasu replied, his gaze sweeping across the other captains. "This is not a man to be fought, or a specimen to be studied. He is a potential catalyst for an extinction-level event. The Central 46 should be convened to authorize the use of the Mutenjokai. The Celestial Stasis Seal. We contain him, permanently, before his presence can cause any further damage to the fabric of our reality." The suggestion hung in the air, chilling the room. A permanent seal was a fate worse than death. It was erasure from time itself. That is a remarkably extreme solution for a man who has, so far, done nothing but save 2 innocent souls from hollows, a gentle, yet firm voice countered. Captain Jishiro Yukitaki of the 13th Division, his white hair a stark contrast to his black robes, met Kujiyasu's gaze. He was interrupted by a racking cough that shook his frail body, but when he recovered, his eyes were clear and determined. "Captain Yukitaki, with all due respect, your compassion is admirable, but misplaced," Kujiyasu said smoothly. "A wildfire is not evil, but we do not allow it to burn simply because it provides warmth." "And a sun is not a wildfire," Yukitaki retorted, his voice gaining strength. "I have felt his spiritual pressure, as have you all. There is no malice in it. No hunger, no rage. It is life, warmth. It is the antithesis of a hollow's energy. You see an unbalanced equation, Captain. I see a potential counterweight. A force for purification the likes of which we have never seen." Yukitaki took a slow breath, a decision solidifying in his expression. "Captain Commander, I will take responsibility for him. Bring him to the 13th Division. Let us observe him, understand him, not cage him like a beast based on unsubstantiated fear." Yamamoto's eyes finally opened, ancient and sharp as obsidian chips. They flickered from the cold certainty of Kujiyasu to the earnest conviction of Yukitaki. The silence stretched. "Very well," the Captain Commander's voice boomed, the sound of grinding stones. "Captain Yukitaki, this anomaly is now your division's problem. You will assess his capabilities, determine his origins, and you will be held solely accountable for his actions. The rest of you are to see. Consider him under the jurisdiction of the 13th until further notice. Do not interfere." He gave a pointed look toward Mayuri and Kenpachi. "This meeting is adjourned." As the captains began to file out, Shunsui drifted over to his old friend. "You've taken on quite a burden, Jishiro. Are you sure about this?" Yukitaki smiled, a genuine, hopeful expression that seemed to chase some of the weariness from his face. "I'm not sure of anything, Shunsui. But when I felt his power, for a moment, this old body of mine felt warm. I have to believe that means something." From across the room, Captain Kujiyasu watched them. His expression unreadable. He had lost the political gambit, but his conviction had not wavered. He had seen the data. He had felt the ripple in the world's balance. Yukitaki's sentimentality, he thought, may have just doomed them all. The 13th Division was a different world from the stark formality of the 1st. Here, the air was lighter, the scent of the gardens Yukitaki cultivated hung in the breeze. And the sounds of its 2 famously loud-mouthed third seats, Sentaro Katsubuki and Kion Katetsu, were a near-constant feature. "He's coming here. The anomaly. Captain Yukitaki is bringing him here personally," Sentaro announced, puffing out his chest. "And you think you'll be on the welcoming committee?" Kion scoffed, hands on her hips. "The captain will want someone competent and level-headed to make the first impression. Obviously, he'll choose me. As if. Your spiritual pressure is so jumpy you'd probably faint." Their bickering was cut short as the entire division fell silent. A presence was approaching. It wasn't the familiar, gentle ripple of their captain's power. It was something else, vast and overwhelming, but held in such tight check that it felt like standing next to a dam holding back an ocean. Every Shinigami in the courtyard, from the newest recruit to the seasoned officers, felt a primal instinct to draw their blade and run, all at the same time. Captain Yukitaki walked into the main courtyard, and beside him was the source. The man from the reports. Up close, he was less imposing than his power suggested. He had a friendly, open face, the blue of his eyes seemed to hold an ancient depth. He walked with an easy, confident stride, his hands tucked in the pockets of his strange orange jacket. He wasn't looking at them with arrogance, but with a calm, curious assessment that was somehow more unnerving. Everyone, this is Naruto Uzumaki, Yukitake announced, his voice carrying a deliberate calm to soothe his subordinates' frayed nerves. He will be joining our division as a guest, effective immediately. He is to be afforded every courtesy. His training and integration will be a priority. Naruto gave a short, polite nod. Hey, he said simply. The single word was so normal, so disarming, that it created a ripple of confusion through the assembled squad. Rukia, Yukitake called out. From the edge of the assembled Shinigami, a petite figure stepped forward. She was composed, her posture ramrod straight, her dark violet eyes cool and professional. Her black hair was impeccably styled, save for a single, stubborn lock that fell between her eyes. Rukia Kuchiki came to a halt and bowed crisply. Captain Rukia, this is Naruto, Yukitake said. You are one of our most capable and adaptable officers. I am assigning you to be his partner and guide. You will be responsible for his orientation, his training, and for reporting his progress directly to me. Rukia's composure didn't slip, but inwardly, her mind reeled. This was the anomaly. The being the captains had held an emergency meeting over. And Yukitake was handing him to her. It was an immense responsibility, a test, and a monumental headache all rolled into one. She looked at Naruto. He was watching her, not with the condescension she sometimes got from those who knew of her adoption into the Kuchiki clan, but with a straightforward, open curiosity. The sheer, banked power humming beneath his skin was terrifying, but his expression was kind. It will be my honor, Captain, she said, her voice betraying none of her turmoil. She turned to Naruto and gave a slight, formal bow. I am Rukia Kuchiki. It is a pleasure to meet you. Naruto smiled, a genuine grin that reached his eyes. Naruto Uzumaki. Looking forward to working with you, Kuchiki-san. Just Rukia is fine, she said. A bit more stiffly than she intended. The casual use of her family name felt too familiar. Our duties begin immediately. Captain Yukitake has authorized a perimeter patrol in the less populated areas of the Seraite. It will serve to familiarize you with the layout. Lead the way, Naruto said, his easygoing nature a stark contrast to her rigid formality. As they walked away, Yukitake watched them go, a thoughtful look on his face. The sun and the snowflake. Perhaps the contrast was exactly what they both needed. The patrol was a quiet, tense affair. Rukia moved the practiced efficiency of a seasoned Shinigami, her senses alert. Naruto walked beside her, his gait relaxed, but his eyes were constantly moving, taking everything in. He wasn't just looking, he was analyzing. The walls are embedded with sekiseki, correct? He asked suddenly, breaking the silence. To inhibit spiritual powers. Rukia blinked, surprised by the technical nature of the question. Yes, it forms the foundation of all our defenses. Smart, he mused. But what about aerial threats? Your patrols seem focused on the ground level. Do you have dedicated anti-air Kido Corps lookout posts? The Seraite's airspace is protected by a spherical barrier, she explained, feeling a bit like she was being quizzed by a strategist. It can only be opened by specific authorization. A barrier can be broken. He stated simply. It wasn't a criticism, just an observation. Defenses should always be layered. Rukia found herself growing slightly irritated. Who was this man, who had been here for all of 2 hours? To question centuries of Shinigami defensive doctrine. Our systems have proven effective, she said coolly. Everything is effective until it isn't, he replied, his tone still mild. He looked at her, and his expression softened. Sorry, old habits. I used to be in charge of a village. Security was my life. The admission caught her off guard. A village. Was at what they called communities in the world he came from. Before she could ask, a piercing shriek echoed from the sky. Both of them looked up. A garganta, a black rift between worlds, had torn open directly above them. It was an unsanctioned, violent tear, and from its depths, a massive form began to emerge. Rukia's blood ran cold. It was a Manos Grande. A Jillian class, the foot soldiers of the Hollow Armies. Here, inside the Seraite, it was impossible, a catastrophic breach of security. Her hand flew to the hilt of her white katana, Soda no Shirayuki. Seraite Communication Corps, this is Rukia Kuchiki of the 13th Division. Code Black. Manos Grande sighted at Sector 7 Gamma. Requesting immediate backup, she yelled into her communication device, her voice strained with urgency. The Manos was fully through now. A towering black-robed giant with a long, pointed nose mask and a multitude of vacant eyes. It let out another soul-shaking roar that rattled the very cobblestones. Rukia's mind raced. Backup would take minutes. A Jillion was too much for a single-seated officer to handle alone. It required coordination, powerful Kido to bind it, and a precise, high-power strike to the mask. Her Shikai was powerful, but it might not be enough. She had to try. She had to delay it. Bakudo number 61. Raikujokuro. She chanted, her hands flashing through the seals. 6 wide beams of light shot out, slamming into the Manos' torso. Holding it in place, the creature strained, and the light prison began to crack almost immediately. "Okay," Naruto said beside her, his voice still impossibly calm. "Big, ugly, and loud. Got it. Stay back," Rukia ordered, drawing her blade. "This is a Class 3 threat. You are not equipped to." Rukia, his voice cut through her panic. It was quiet, but hell. In absolute authority that made her stop. He had stepped in front of her, placing himself directly between her and the struggling Manos. "Allow me," he said. He raised his right hand, palm up. The air above it began to warp, to twist. A sound filled the air, a high-pitched, whirring hum that grew in intensity. Rukia stared, her eyes wide. A sphere of pure, churning energy was forming in his palm. It wasn't Kido, there was no chant, no incantation. It was a vortex of brilliant blue-white spiritual power, spinning so fast it was almost invisible, contained in a perfect, fist-sized orb. The concentration of power was breathtaking. It made the air thrum. The Manos finally shattered the light prison and let out a triumphant roar, its massive mouth opening to gather the crimson energy of a Sero. Naruto didn't even seem to notice. With a fluid, practiced motion, he lunged forward. He moved with a speed that defied his casual posture, a burst of motion that was almost instantaneous. "Rasengan," he said, the name of the technique a quiet declaration. He slammed the spinning sphere into the Manos' thick leg. There was no grand explosion. No deafening boom. For a microsecond, there as only the sound of a million tiny chimes as the Rasengan made contact. Then, the Manos' leg simply ceased to be. The spiraling energy ground through spirit matter like a diamond drill through glass, but instead of shattering it, it unwound it, atomized it, turning it back into its base spiritual particles. The vortex of power traveled up the creature's body in a heartbeat. The Manos' Sero fizzled out before it could form. Its roar died in its throat, replaced by a silent scream of non-existence. Its colossal form was consumed by the spiraling blue light, dissolving from the point of impact outwards. It didn't fall. It was erased. In less than 2 seconds, the entire, towering creature was gone, leaving behind nothing but a shower of shimmering golden and blue motes that drifted gently on the breeze before fading away. The alley fell into a profound silence. Rukia stood frozen, her Zanpakuto half-drawn, her mouth slightly agape. The incantation for her next binding spell died on her lips. She stared at the empty space where a Manos Grande had been. Her mind, so sharp and analytical, simply refused to process what it had just witnessed. She had been preparing for a desperate, life-or-death struggle. He had ended it. He had ended a Manos Grande with a single, casual blow, using a technique she couldn't begin to comprehend. Naruto landed lightly on his feet, dusting off his pal. As if he'd just gotten rid of a little dirt. He turned back to her, that same easygoing smile on his face, though his blue eyes held a sharp, focused light. "See," he said. "No problem." Rukia couldn't find her voice. She could only stare at the man who was supposed to be her responsibility, this golden anomaly, and she was struck by a single, terrifying, and undeniable thought. He wasn't a problem for the Seraite to manage. He was on a level entirely of his own. On a distant rooftop, hidden in the shadows of a pagoda, Captain Kajiyasu Fumihiro lowered a pair of Kido-enhanced binoculars. He had felt the rip of the Garganta, the appearance of the Manos, and then the incredible spike of the anomaly's power. And then, just as quickly, the Manos' spiritual signature had vanished. Not faded, not defeated, vanished, utterly and completely. He closed his eyes, his handsome face a mask of cold, hard certainty. Yukatake was a fool. This was not a counterweight. This was a force of nature walking in their midst. A power that answered to no law they understood. His lieutenant, a nervous man named Janae, appeared beside him via Shunpo. Captain, the reports. They say the Manos is gone. Did he? Kujiyasu didn't look at him. He stared down at the distant figures of the anomaly and the Kuchiki girl, a tiny sun and a speck of darkness in the vast city. The equation is more unbalanced than I could have ever imagined, Kujiyasu said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. The anomaly is not a potential threat. He is an active one. He gripped the hilt of his sheathed zanpakuto, his knuckles turning white. He must be contained, by any means necessary. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The weight of a name. Rukia Kuchiki prided herself on the precision of her reports. They were factual, concise, and devoid of emotional hyperbole. But as she stood before Captain Yukatake in his private chambers, the ink on the parchment feeling woefully inadequate, she found it difficult to maintain that professional distance. The scent of medicinal herbs and old books filled the air, a familiar comfort that did nothing to soothe the tremor in her hands. He called it a Rasengan, she finished. Her voice a model of composure she did not feel. It produced no explosive force. The Jillian was not blown apart or incinerated. It was unwound, deconstructed at a molecular level. The entire process took less than 2 seconds. Captain Yukatake sat on a tatami mat, a steaming cup of tea before him untouched. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his gaze fixed on the tranquil garden beyond his open shoji screen. He hadn't coughed once since she'd entered. The sheer shock of the news seemed to have momentarily granted him a reprieve from his chronic illness. And Naruto-kun's demeanor? He asked, his voice soft. Casual, Rukia admitted, the word tasting like an absurdity. He treated the elimination of a Manos Grande with the same gravity as swatting a fly. He seemed more concerned with the structural integrity of the Seraite's defensive barriers. Yukatake finally allowed a small, tired smile to touch his lips. A leader's mind, it seems. He sees the whole board, not just the pieces in front of him. He turned his gaze to her, and his eyes, so often clouded with pain, were sharp and perceptive. You were unsettled, Rukia. It was not a question. Captain, with respect, his power defies classification. It is not Kido. It is not Zanjutsu. The spiritual pressure it generates is pure, refined to a degree that should be impossible. To place a weapon of that magnitude in my hands and call it orientation feels like an immense burden. Yukatake finished for her. He sighed, a sound like rustling leaves. Or perhaps, an immense opportunity. The Central 46, and Captain Kujiyasu in particular, see him as a nail to be hammered down. A problem to be contained. I see a man who, from all accounts, used his power to defend the innocent and then to protect a fellow Shinigami, you. I need to know the character of that man, Rukia. I can't learn that from spiritual pressure readings or sterile reports. I need your eyes, your judgment. You have always been an exceptional judge of character. The unspoken reference to her past, to Ichigo Kurosaki, hung in the air between them. She had seen something in a human boy that no one else had, and it had changed the course of the Soul Society. The captain was trusting her to do it again. The weight on her shoulders settled, no longer just a burden, but a mantle of responsibility. I understand, Captain, she said, her back straightening with renewed purpose. I will not fail you. I know you won't, he said warmly. The official directive is to integrate him. That means full Shinigami combat training. Zanjutsu, Hakuda, Hoho, and Kido. We must see how his abilities translate to our disciplines. And most importantly, we must see if he can communicate with a Zanpakuto. Find his limits, Rukia. Find his strengths. But also, find the man. Naruto was waiting for her in the division's main dojo, and Asachi, the nameless, formless blade given to all new recruits, resting on his lap. He was sitting cross-legged, perfectly still, a stark contrast to the restless energy she had sensed from him before. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes clear. Ready for my first day of school, sensei? He asked, a playful glint in his eyes. Rukia's lips thinned. This is not school, and I am not your sensei. I am your assigned partner. The first lesson is Hakuda. Unarmed combat. You will face the 4th seat officer, Hydra. From the corner of the dojo, a mountain of a man stood up. Hydra was broad-shouldered and bald, his arms thick as tree trunks. He was the division's foremost Hakuda specialist, a man who RRED to pulverize hollows with his bare hands. He gave Naruto a grim look, cracking his knuckles with a sound like rocks grinding together. I'll go easy on him, Kuchiki-san, Hydra rumbled, clearly unimpressed by Naruto's lean build. No need, Naruto said, rising smoothly to his feet and handing his Asachi to Rukia. I appreciate the lesson. They faced each other in the center of the dojo. Rukia stood back, ready to intervene. This was a baseline test. She wanted to see his raw physical prowess. Hydra took a low stance, a classic Shinigami grappling form. Naruto just stood there, his posture relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. It was an invitation. Hydra charged, a bellowing roar erupting from his chest. He was surprisingly fast for his size, his fist aimed like a cannonball at Naruto's center mass. Naruto didn't retreat. He didn't block. At the last possible microsecond, he shifted his weight, pivoting on his heel. It wasn't shunpo. It was a simple, economical movement, a dancer's turn. Hidetora's massive fist flew past Naruto's ear, the wind of its passage stirring his golden hair. As the larger man stumbled forward from his own momentum, Naruto's right hand chopped down. Not on Hidetora's neck or head, but on the back of his knee. It was a precise, almost surgical strike. Hidetora's leg buckled instantly. He grunted in surprise and tried to spin, bringing a backhand crashing around. Naruto was no longer there. He had ducked under the swing, his left palm striking Hidetora's exposed side, just below the ribs. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was perfectly placed. Hidetora's breath hitched, his muscles spasming. He's using his size against him, Rukia murmured to herself, her eyes wide. Naruto was flowing around the bigger man, a leaf in the wind. He was using minimal force, redirecting Hidetora's own immense strength, making him overextend, leaving him off balance. It was a masterful display of technique over brute force. Enraged and embarrassed, Hydra roared and threw technique aside, opting for a wild bear hug, trying to crush his elusive opponent. Naruto met the charge head-on. Just as Hidetora's arms were about to close around him, Naruto dropped, sweeping the man's feet out from under him. As Hydra fell backward, a great timbering crash, Naruto used his momentum to flip forward, landing lightly on the man's chest, one hand held open, inches from his throat. The dojo was silent. The entire spar had lasted 10 seconds. Yield? Naruto asked, his voice perfectly level. Hydra, winded and utterly bewildered, slapped the mat with a meaty hand. Yield? Naruto hopped off him and offered a hand, pulling the much larger man to his feet with a surprising show of strength. You're strong. If you'd landed one of those, I'd be in the 4th Division headquarters for a week. The compliment was genuine, and it took the sting out of Hidetora's defeat. He just nodded, looking at Naruto with a newfound respect. Rukia stared, her mind cataloging the fight. Naruto hadn't used a single flashy move. No overwhelming power. Just flawless technique, spatial awareness, and a level of combat instinct that was simply off the charts. His experience in his past life. It must have been a lifetime of constant battle. Your Hakuda is sufficient, she said, her voice tight. Next, Zanjutsu. She tossed him the Asachi, and he caught it deftly. She drew her own pristine white blade, Soda no Shirayuki. The goal of Zanjutsu is not merely to cut. It is an extension of the soul, a conversation in steel. The basics are stance, grip, and the 4 main forms of attack: thrust, slash, sweep, and parry. Observe. She moved through a basic kata, her movements fluid and precise, a dance of deadly grace. Each cut was clean, each stance perfect. She was a textbook example of Shinigami swordsmanship. Your turn, she said. Naruto mimicked the kata. His first attempt was clumsy. His grip was wrong, his balance was off, his cuts were wide. He was holding the katana like a broadsword, a tool for hacking. No, Rukia said sharply, stepping forward. Your stance is too wide. It's for power, not for speed. Bring your feet closer. She used the sheath of her sword to tap his ankles. Your grip. It's a death grip. You'll have no flexibility. Loosen it. Let the blade be a part of your arm, not a rock you're trying to throw. She moved behind him, placing her hands over his on the hilt of the Asachi, correcting his finger placement. A jolt went through her at the contact. His hands were calloused and warm, the skin tough from a lifetime of work. She could feel the coiled strength in his forearms, the sheer latent power held in reserve. For a moment, she was acutely aware of his height, his presence behind her, and she felt a flush creep up her neck. Like this? He asked, his voice a low rumble near her ear. She snatched her hands away as if burned. Yes, now, again, from the top, he went through the kata again. This time, it was better. Still not perfect, but the improvement was noticeable. They spent the next hour like that. Rukia would demonstrate, criticize, and correct. Naruto would listen, adapt, and repeat. The start, Ling thing was the speed at which he learned. His body seemed to have a terrifying muscle memory, an innate understanding of combat that allowed him to absorb imperfect physical movements at an astonishing rate. By the end of the hour, his kata was nearly as clean as hers. "You're a natural," she said, the words grudging but honest. "I've used swords before," he admitted, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "But not like this. This is more elegant." He gave her a small smile. "You're a good teacher. Very patient." Rukia felt that strange heat in her cheeks again. "I am not patient. You are simply a fast learner. Let's move on to Ho-Ho. The art of high-speed movement. We call it Shunpo. Flash step." Naruto translated, a look of understanding on his face. "Got it. Something similar in my old world. We just called it the body flicker technique." They moved to a wide, open training ground dotted with rock formations. "The principle is simple," Rukia explained. "Focusing spiritual power to your feet to achieve instantaneous movement. The goal is efficiency and control. We will race from here to the tallest rock formation. The first to touch the top wins." "You're on," Naruto said with a grin. Rukia took a deep breath. Focusing. She was fast. Her Shunpo was a point of pride. She was one of the faster non-lieutenant officers. Go. In a flicker of movement, she was gone, leaving only a faint whisper of displaced air. She reappeared 100 meters away, already beginning her next step. She glanced back, expecting to have a massive lead. He was right beside her. He wasn't moving like a Shinigami. There was no telltale flicker. He was just moving, a solid blur of orange and black, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground. His movements were less precise than hers, more explosive. But the raw speed was incredible. He was keeping pace with her effortlessly. A competitive fire lit in Rukia's eyes. She pushed herself harder, her form becoming a textbook display of perfect Shunpo, a series of seamless, linked steps. She pulled ahead slightly. She could hear him laughing behind her, a sound of pure exhilaration. "Not bad, Rukia-chan," he yelled, the informal suffix making her bristle. Then he poured on the speed. His form became even less refined, a raw explosion of power. He wasn't just running. He was practically flying, bounding off the ground in great, impossible leaps. Using the rock formations as springboards, he overtook her in a blur, landed on the side of the final rock formation, and just ran straight up it, defying gravity. He stood at the top, grinning down at her as she appeared beside him a second later, panting slightly. "That," she said, trying to catch her breath, "was not Shunpo." "Close enough," he said, still grinning. "You focus on single, perfect steps. I just go, like a cannonball versus a sniper rifle. You're more precise, but I think I've got you on raw power." She couldn't even argue. He was right. It was the story of all his training so far. Her technique was perfect, honed by centuries of tradition. His was raw, instinctive, and overwhelmingly effective. The final, and most crucial, part of his training was Jinzen. The meditative practice of communicating with one's Zanpakuto spirit. Without this, an Asachi would never gain a name, never unlock its Shikai. They sat in a quiet, secluded room. A Zanpakuto is a reflection of the Shinigami's soul. Rukia explained. To know its name, you must first know yourself. Clear your mind. Let go of your thoughts. Reach inward, into the sea of your soul, and listen for the voice that is not your own. Naruto closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He tried. He really did. But his mind was not a place that could be easily cleared. It was a maelstrom of memories, of triumphs and failures, of faces loved and lost. It was the roar of 1,000 battles and the quiet hum of a village at peace. And beneath it all, a deep, primal warmth, a slumbering consciousness that was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. "I can't," he said, opening his eyes after an hour. He looked genuinely frustrated for the first time. "It's not quiet in there. It's loud, bright. There's no sea. It feels more like a sun." Rukia frowned. This was the one area where his incredible talent seemed to fail him. Every Shinigami, no matter how weak, had the potential to hear their Zanpakuto. For him, a being of such immense power, to be unable to do so was a profound paradox. It was his one glaring failure, and it grated on her as much as it did on him. Word of the 13th Division's EU powerhouse spread through the Seraite like wildfire. Rumors of his monstrous spiritual pressure had been one thing, but stories of him dismantling Hydra in seconds and keeping pace with Rukia Kuchiki were another. It was only a matter of time before the trouble found him. It came in the form of Renji Abarai and Akaku Madarame. Naruto and Rukia were walking through a courtyard when the two men blocked their path. Renji, the fiery-haired lieutenant of the 6th Division, had his trademark smirk on his face. Akaku, the bald, battle-crazed third seat of the 11th, was grinning like a shark that had just smelled blood. "So, you're the famous anomaly," Renji said, looking Naruto up and down. "Heard you took out Amanos. I'm not impressed. Jillians are just big, dumb targets." "Renji," Rukia snapped, "show some respect. Respect is earned in a fight," Akaku cut in, his eyes gleaming. "We've heard you're fast and strong, but you haven't even got a Shikai. How about you prove you're more than just a freak of nature with a lot of pressure? Me and Renji, against you. Right here, right now." Naruto looked from Akaku's manic grin to Renji's arrogant smirk. He glanced at Rukia, who looked torn between anger and concern. He then turned back to them, and a slow, confident smile spread across his face. "All right," he said, "I've got a little time to kill. But let's set some ground rules. 2-on-1 isn't much of a fair test. So how about this? I won't use my Rasengan, and I won't use any of my other tricks. Just the Hakuda and Shunpo I've been learning. And this," he said, patting the Asachi at his hip. Renji and Akaku exchanged a look. This was better than they could have hoped for. The man was hamstringing himself. It was pure arrogance. "You're on," Akaku roared, already pulling his Zanpakuto from its sheath. "This is gonna be fun." They moved to the 11th Division's massive, cratered training ground, a place built for destructive spars. A crowd of squad members quickly gathered, drawn by the promise of a high-level fight. Naruto stood in the center, facing the two of them. Rukia stood on the sidelines, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of worry. "Let's dance," Renji yelled, and the fight was on. He shot forward, his blade already extending. Roar! Zabumaru! The segmented blade of his Shikai lashed out like a bladed whip, aiming to ensnare and shred Naruto. Simultaneously, Akaku used Shunpo to appear at Naruto's flank. Extend! Hozukimaru! His spear-like Zanpakuto jabbed towards Naruto's ribs. It was a classic pincer attack, designed to overwhelm an opponent from two directions at once. Naruto didn't try to block. He dropped low, the bladed segments of Zabumaru whistling over his head. At the same time, he stomped his foot down, hard. Not on the ground, but on the shaft of Akaku's incoming spear, which was aimed low. The unexpected, downward force deflected Hozukimaru's point into the dirt, and Akaku grunted as his wrists were violently jarred. Using the brief opening, Naruto exploded upwards. He didn't attack. He grabbed the chain-like body of the retracting Zabumaru with his bare hands. Renji yelped in surprise as his blade was suddenly anchored. Naruto used the momentum to swing, not himself, but Renji. He pulled hard, yanking the surprised lieutenant off his feet and swinging him in a wide arc, directly into Akaku, who was just pulling his spear from the ground. The two Shinigami collided with a comical thump, a tangle of limbs and surprise. "What the hell?" Renji sputtered, trying to untangle himself from Akaku. "He used you like a wrecking ball," Akaku growled, shoving Renji off him. The crowd murmured. They hadn't expected tactics. They had expected a slugfest. Come on, Naruto taunted, beckoning with his fingers. I thought this was supposed to be a challenge. The taunt worked. Renji and Akaku came at him again, this time more coordinated. Renji provided ranged pressure with Zabumaru, forcing Naruto to stay mobile, while Akaku relentlessly pressed in for close quarters combat. It was a beautiful, chaotic dance. Naruto was a blur of orange and black. He parried Akaku's spear with his Asachi, the scree. ECH of steel on steel echoing across the field. He ducked and weaved through the unpredictable arcs of Zabumaru. He wasn't just defending. He was thinking, analyzing, waiting. He saw his opening. He load one of Zabumaru's segments to get close, then parried it with his sword not away from him, but directly into the path of Akaku's next thrust. The spear tip clanged uselessly against the hardened steel of Renji's own Shikai. In that split second of confusion, Naruto moved. He used Shunpo, appearing directly in front of Renji. He didn't draw his sword. He slammed the pommel of his Asachi into Renji's sternum. The blow was precise and brutally effective. Renji gasped, the air driven from his lungs, and staggered back. Naruto spun, his Asachi now free. Akaku was already upon him, Hazuka Maru separating into its three-sectioned staff form, a whirling storm of wood and steel. This is what I live for. Akaku roared, his attacks becoming a frenzied, joyous blur. Naruto met the storm. He didn't try to match Akaku's wild energy. He was a rock in the river, his defense tight and economical. He used his simple blade to parry and deflect the three-sectioned staff, his footwork keeping him perfectly balanced. He was being driven back, but he wasn't losing ground. He was dictating the retreat. He led Akaku towards one of the large rock pillars at the edge of the training ground. With a final, powerful parry that sent a jolt up Akaku's arms, Naruto used Shunpo to disappear. Akaku blinked, his senses screaming. Behind you, Renji, who had recovered his breath, yelled a warning. Akaku spun, swinging his weapon in a defensive arc. But Naruto wasn't there. He was above. Naruto had used Shunpo to flash to the top of the rock pillar. As Akaku turned, Naruto pushed off, dropping down like a hawk. He didn't aim for Akaku. He aimed for his weapon. Naruto's foot slammed down on the chain connecting the sections of Hozukimaru, pinning it to the ground. Akaku was left holding one section of his weapon. The other two trapped under Naruto's boot. He stared, wide-eyed. Naruto, still balancing on the weapon's chain, drew his Asachi and held the tip an inch from Akaku's neck. At the same time, Renji charged in from behind, Zabumaru ready. I wouldn't, Naruto said calmly, not taking his eyes off Akaku. Unless you want to see if your lieutenant is faster than my blade. The field fell silent. Renji froze, his Shikai hovering in the air. Akaku stared at the blank, nameless sword at his throat, then up at the calm blue eyes of the man holding it. He wasn't angry. He was ecstatic. A huge, manic grin split his face. Ha! Ha 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 ha! He boomed, his laughter echoing. He dropped the section of his weapon he was holding. I yield. I yield. That was magnificent. Naruto removed his blade from Akaku's neck and hopped off Hozukimaru. Renji, looking thoroughly humbled, let Zabumaru retract into its katana form with a sigh. He had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and neutralized. You're a monster, Renji said, but there was no malice in it. Only grudging respect. No wonder Byakuya's been so quiet about you. Naruto just shrugged, sheathing his Asachi. You guys are pretty tough. We should do this again sometime. As the crowd dispersed, buzzing with what they'd just seen, Rukia walked over. She looked at the scuff marks on Naruto's jacket, the triumphant grin on Akaku's face, and the humbled expression on her childhood friend's. You were reckless, she said, her voice low. I was fine, he countered, his smile softening as he looked at her. You were toying with them. I was learning, he corrected gently. They're strong. I needed to see how they fight. Later that evening, they sat on the Ingawa of the 13th Division barracks, looking out at the gardens. The air was cool and quiet. Naruto was nursing a bottle of water, a few scrapes on his knuckles the only evidence of the fight. How did you know how to do that? Rukia asked, breaking the silence. To use Renji's own weapon against Akaku. To predict their movements. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, watching the koi swim in the pond below. I told you I used to run a village, he said softly. Before that, my whole life was a fight. Not just for me, but for my friends. For my home. I wasn't the strongest, or the smartest, not for a long time. I had to learn to read people. To understand how they think. How they move. To see 3 steps ahead, or you'd die. He took a sip of water. And I had a partner inside me. A powerful, angry one. I had to learn to work with him, to understand his power and my own. I made him a promise, that we'd never be alone again. Rukia stared at him. The casual way he spoke of a partner inside him sent a shiver down her spine. It sounded almost like, but that was impossible. But his words about promises, about partnership, struck a chord deep within her. She thought of Kai and Sheba, of his warmth, his kindness, and the crushing guilt she still carried over his death. She had been unable to save her partner then. I understand, she whispered, more to herself than to him. The weight of a promise, it can be a heavy thing to carry. Naruto looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the stern, professional Shinigami. He saw the flicker of an old, deep pain in her violet eyes. He didn't press. He didn't ask. He just gave a small, understanding nod. In that shared silence, a fragile bridge of empathy formed between them, stronger than any clash of swords. In the silent, sterile archives of the 9th Division, Captain Cage. Yasu Fumihiro stood before a towering shelf of forbidden texts. His lieutenant, Janae, stood nervously by the door. The reports on the spar were illuminating, Kajiyasu said, his back to Janae as he ran a gloved finger along the spines of ancient scrolls. He defeated a lieutenant and a renowned third-seat officer without using the power that erased Amanos. His tactical acumen is as dangerous as his spiritual pressure. Perhaps Captain Yukitaki is right, Janae ventured hesitantly. Perhaps he can be an asset. An asset. Kajiyasu spun around, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that made Janae flinch. An earthquake can be an asset if you wish to demolish a city. A tsunami can be an asset if you wish to wash the land clean. He is a force of nature, Janae, and nature is ambivalent. It does not care for our laws, our balance, our survival. It simply is. He pulled a thick, dust-covered scroll from the shelf. The kanji on it were archaic, the spiritual energy radiating from its seal dark and heavy. Our world is a precisely crafted mechanism. The anomaly is a gear that does not fit, one whose rotation threatens to shatter the entire machine. If the Royal Guard will not act, if the Captain Commander will not see reason, then the duty falls to the one who understands the schematics. He held up the scroll. Order must be maintained, at any cost. Yukitaki had summoned them to his private garden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air was filled with the scent of moon orchids. Rukia tells me you are struggling with Jinzen, Yukitaki said to Naruto, his tone gentle. Naruto nodded, looking frustrated. I can't seem to quiet my mind, Captain. It's not how I'm built. Perhaps you are trying to walk a path that is not your own, Yukitaki mused. A Shinigami's soul is often depicted as a body of water, and Jinzen is the act of plumbing its depths. But you described your soul as a sun. You do not find things in the sun by diving into it. You find things by feeling its heat. By following its light. He gestured for Naruto to sit. Do not try to empty your mind, Naruto-kun. Fill it with your purpose. Your bonds. The people you fought for. The promise you made to your partner. Don't search for a voice in the silence. Follow the warmth. Follow the light to its source. Naruto looked at Rukia, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He closed his eyes. He stopped fighting the noise in his head. He let the memories, the faces, the feelings wash over him. He focused on the promise to Kurama. He thought of his friends, his family, of Jiraiya, of his parents. He reached for the warmth, the constant, familiar presence that had been with him for as long as he could remember. And he followed it. The world dissolved. He was no longer in a garden. He was standing on a vast, sun-drenched plain. The grass was gold, the sky a brilliant, cloudless expanse of yellow. There was no cage, no sewer, no darkness. There was only light and warmth and an overwhelming sense of peace. In the center of the plain, resting with its 9 massive tails spread out like a sunset, was Kurama. He was colossal, majestic, his red-orange fur glowing in the golden light. He opened one massive, slitted eye and looked at Naruto. "Took you long enough, Kit," the voice rumbled, not in Naruto's mind, but in the very air around him. It was the voice of a god, deep and ancient, but it held the familiar, grumpy affection of an old friend. "Kurama," Naruto breathed, a massive grin spreading across his face. "This place, it's different. Our souls fused when you died," Kurama explained, his gaze sweeping across the golden plain. "This is not your mind. This is our soul, one and the same. There is no more cage. No more seal. There is only us." Naruto walked closer, placing a hand on the fox's massive paw. He felt no resistance, only a familiar, comforting warmth. "So, the Shinigami, they're Zanpakuto. It's a part of their soul. I've been looking for another voice, but..." Kurama let out a low chuckle, a sound like a controlled earthquake. "You've been looking for a tenant in a house that only has one owner. I am your power, Naruto. I am your rage, your will, and your weapon. I am your Zanpakuto spirit. You don't need to find a sword. You just need to draw ours." Understanding dawned on Naruto, bright and powerful as the sun above them. It was so simple, so obvious. He had never been alone. "What will you call us?" Kurama asked. Naruto looked at his hand on Kurama's paw, at the unbreakable connection between them, a bond forged in hatred, loneliness, and finally, in absolute trust and friendship. A bond that had transcended life and death. "The bonds of the sun," Naruto said, his voice filled with certainty. Back in Yukataki's garden, the Asachi lying on Naruto's lap began to glow. A soft, golden light emanated from the steel, growing in intensity. Rukia and Yukataki watched, mesmerized. Naruto's eyes snapped open. They were glowing with the same golden light. His pupils slitted for a barest fraction of a second. He reached down and gripped the hilt of the sword. The light flared, becoming almost blinding. He lifted the blade, and the words came to him, as natural as breathing. "Reaffirm," he commanded, his voice imbued with a new, resonant power. "Taiyo no Kazuna." The light condensed, reshaping the plain Asachi. The blade elongated slightly, becoming a sleek, perfectly balanced odachi. The cross guard formed into a stylized, sun-like emblem, and a simple, golden tassel hung from the pommel. It wasn't ornate or menacing. It was simple, elegant, and radiated a palpable, life-affirming warmth that pushed back the evening chill and made the very flowers in the garden seem to stand a little taller. Rukia stared, not at the sword, but at the man holding it. The anomaly finally had a name for his power, and in the face of that brilliant, gentle light, she felt not fear, but a profound and inexplicable sense of hope. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. The Silent Errata. The first report was a whisper, a minor clerical error logged by a low-ranking officer in the 12th Division's Department of Research and Development. A small village on the far eastern edge of the 80th District, Zaraki's notoriously lawless domain, had gone spiritually dark. Its collective soul count, a number usually as stable as any census, had dropped to 0 over the course of a single night. The initial assessment was a mass transmigration or, more likely, a faulty sensor array. Such things happened. The Rukongai was vast, its outer reaches chaotic. The second report came 3 days later. A neighboring village, 5 miles from the first, also went dark. Then a third, a day after that. This was no longer a clerical error. An investigative team from the 11th Division, dispatched by a grumbling Kenpachi who hated paperwork more than weak opponents, arrived to find nothing. Not ruins, not bodies, not the lingering, acrid stench of a mass hollow feeding. Just nothing. The hovels were still standing, albeit coated in a strange gray film. Bowls of half-eaten food sat on tables. A child's top lay abandoned in a dusty street. But there were no souls. No plus souls. No residual spiritual energy. No Kanpaku to be guided. There was not even the faintest echo of their existence in the Reishi record. It was as if the villages and everyone in them had been a dream. And the Soul Society had just woken up. The report, typed up by a deeply unnerved Yumichika Yasugawa, landed on the captain commander's desk. Its title was simple and chilling. The Silent Errata. It was as if a celestial archivist had simply decided a few pages of reality were superfluous and erased them from the book of life. An emergency meeting was not called. Panic was a luxury the Gote 13 could not afford. Instead, a hand-picked team was assembled under the authority of Captain Yukitake. The mission was not combat. It was reconnaissance. The objective: to witness this phenomenon firsthand, to understand its nature, and to return with actionable intelligence. Naruto and Rukia stood in the 13th Division's briefing room alongside 5 other seated officers from their squad. A large map of the Rukongai was spread on the table, the 3 erased villages marked with stark black ink. The 11th Division's report confirms a complete absence of spiritual matter, Rukia briefed the team. Her voice crisp and professional, betraying none of the unease she felt. No signs of combat, no Garganta residue. The only anomaly noted was an unusual atmospheric condition, described as a creeping gray fog, that seemed to absorb sound and dampen spiritual pressure. So we're walking into a ghost story. One of the officers, a burly man named Kosuke, muttered. We are walking in with our eyes open. Naruto corrected him, his gaze sweeping over the team. He had his new shikai, Taiyo no Kazuna, strapped to his back, its presence a comforting warmth. We move in pairs. Constant communication. If you feel your senses being dulled, you report it immediately. If you see this fog, you do not enter it. You observe from a distance. Our primary goal is not to engage, but to understand. Get in, get the data, get out. His words were calm, authoritative. He wasn't a captain, not even a lieutenant, but he spoke with the quiet confidence of a commander who had sent men into the unknown before. The other officers, who had all witnessed or heard of his spar with Renji and Akaku, nodded in assent. He had their respect. Rukia felt a flicker of pride, which she quickly suppressed. This was no time for sentiment. Their insertion point was a ridge overlooking the next village in the path of the phenomenon, a small settlement named Akiba. From their vantage point, everything looked normal. The sun, the actual sun of the Soul Society, beat down on the dusty streets and ramshackle huts. But there was a stillness to the place. No movement, no sounds of life carried on the wind. And on the eastern edge of the village, they saw it. It wasn't a fog. Fog billows and drifts. This crept. It was a slow-moving wall of discoloration, a patch of reality that seemed to have been desaturated. The vibrant browns of the earth and wood, the faint greens of hardy weeds, all bled into a uniform, silent gray where the phenomenon touched them. It moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, like ink bleeding into paper. By the gods, Kosuke breathed. Rukia, Naruto, you're with me, the lead officer, the 13th third seat Ryunosuke Yuki, commanded. The rest of you, maintain this position. Observe and report any changes. Do not, under any circumstances, break formation. The 3 of them used Shunpo to move to the edge of the village, landing silently on a rooftop 100 yards from the creeping gray boundary. The closer they got, the stranger the feeling became. It was a pressure, but the inverse of a spiritual one. It didn't push, it pulled. It was a void, a vacuum that seemed to leach the energy from the air. The sounds of their own movements were muffled, their senses strangely dulled. My Kido feels sluggish, Ryunosuke noted, his hand glowing with a faint sputter. Light as he tried to cast a simple scouting spell. It's like trying to light a fire underwater. Naruto was quiet, his brow furrowed. He felt it too. The vibrant energy of the world around them was being muted, drained. But his own power, the sun-like furnace of his soul, felt agitated. It wasn't being drained. It was being repulsed, like 2 opposing magnetic fields. Look, Rukia whispered, pointing. At the edge of the gray zone, a figure had appeared. It stumbled out of the desaturated area into the normal part of the village. It was a man, a resident soul, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it had burned past screaming into a state of catatonic shock. He was clutching his arm, which was still shrouded in the gray film. As they watched, the gray slowly crept up past his elbow, and the color, the texture, the very substance of his arm, simply ceased to be. It didn't rot or burn. It was erased. The sleeve of his robe and the flesh beneath it vanished into the creeping nothingness. He let out a choked, soundless sob, and then he saw them. A flicker of desperate hope lit his eyes. He stumbled toward them, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. And then, from the gray wall behind him. More figures emerged. They were not hollows. They weren't Shinigami. They weren't anything Rukia had a name for. They were vaguely humanoid, but their forms were made of shimmering, television-like static. They had no faces, no masks, just a constant, silent churn of gray and black particles. Their very presence was an offense to the senses, a visual representation of the sound dampening, energy leaching void they had emerged from. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, their feet not quite touching the ground. What are they? Ryunosuke breathed, his hand tightening on his Zanpakuto. They're what's doing this, Naruto said, his voice grim. They're pieces of that nothingness, given form. The Silent Ones, as Naruto's mind instantly labeled them, seemed to notice the man trying to flee. One of them glided forward. It didn't run. It simply moved, its speed unnatural. It reached out a hand made of roiling static. We have to help him. Rukia cried, drawing Sota no Shirayuki. Dance. Sota no Shirayuki. Her blade transformed, becoming a ribbon of pure, elegant white. She was about to leap when Naruto's hand clamped down on her shoulder. Wait. The Silent One's hand touched the man's back. There was no impact, no sound. The man's terror-stricken face went slack. The light in his eyes extinguished. And then, starting from the point of contact, his entire body dissolved. Not into reishi particles, not into dust. He just vanished, erased from existence in a silent, expanding ripple of gray. In a heartbeat, there was nothing left but empty space. A cold, profound horror washed over the three Shinigami. This wasn't death. Death was a transition, a cycle. This was an ending, an absolute, unequivocal stop. The group of Silent Ones, 5 of them in total, now turned their faceless forms toward the Shinigami on the rooftop. They had been sensed. Fall back, Ryunosuke ordered, his voice cracking. Fall back to the rendezvous point. Now, he and Rukia turned to leap, but it was too late. 2 of the Silent Ones were suddenly there, having crossed the 100-yard distance in an instant. There was no shunpo flicker, no sound of movement. They simply ceased to be there and began to be here. Ryunosuke reacted on instinct, swinging his blade in a wide, powerful arc. The steel met the arm of the creature, and the blade was unmade. The section of his Zanpakuto that made contact simply vanished, eaten away by the static. Ryunosuke cried out in shock and pain, not from a wound, but from the violation, the spiritual feedback of his own soul sword being partially erased. The creature's other hand reached for his face. Getsuga Tensho. A bolt of energy, not blue-white but brilliant, searing gold, erupted from Naruto's blade. It wasn't a crescent of destructive power. It was a wave of pure, concentrated existence. It slammed into the 2 Silent Ones. They didn't explode. They didn't disintegrate. They recoiled, their static forms flickering violently. A sound like grinding sand finally audible as the golden energy washed over them. The wave of power didn't destroy them, but it hurt them. It pushed them back, solidifying them for a brief, terrible moment, revealing the utter, absolute void that lay beneath their shimmering forms. Naruto grabbed Ryunosuke and Rukia, pulling them back. My attacks work, he yelled. They can be pushed back. His words galvanized them. Rukia, seeing that the enemy was not invincible, regained her footing. Some no mai, Tsukishiro. She created a massive circle of ice on the ground around them, hoping to slow the creature's advance. But as the Silent Ones glided over it, the ice didn't melt. It sublimated, turning from pristine white to dull gray before vanishing into nothing. Her power was being erased on contact. My Kido is useless, she cried in frustration. More of the creatures were pouring out of the gray zone now, a silent, static tide. They were surrounded. The other 5 members of their squad, seeing the fight break out, were charging in to help, ignoring their orders in a panic. No, stay back, Ryunosuke yelled, but his voice was swallowed by the deadening aura. A Silent One appeared beside Kosuke, the burly officer. Before he could even raise his sword, it touched his arm. He screamed, a choked, guttural sound, as his arm, from the fingertips to the shoulder, was simply gone. Not severed, erased. The wound didn't bleed. It was just a smooth, cauterized-looking stump of non-existence. Panic erupted among the squad. Their training, their skills, their very power, it was all meaningless here. This is a retreat. A full retreat. Ryunosuke screamed, his face pale with terror. But there was nowhere to run. The silent ones were closing in from all sides, their presence leeching the strength from their bodies. The hope from their hearts. It was a slaughter. Rukia felt a cold dread seize her. This was how it ended. Not in a glorious battle, but in a silent, gray erasure. She stood back to back with Naruto. Her blade held ready, though she knew it was useless. Rukia, Naruto said, his voice grim but steady. I can hold them back. But I can't destroy them. Not fast enough. I'm going to create a path. You get the others out of here. That's an order. I'm not leaving you, she retorted, her voice fierce. That wasn't a request. He shot back, his tone hardening to steel. For a second, he wasn't the easygoing anomaly. He was the Hokage, the cage of a great village, a man used to making hard decisions and having them obeyed. You're the ranking officer who can still function. Your duty is to your squad. Get them to safety. I'll be right behind you. He didn't wait for her reply. He took a deep breath, and the gentle warmth that perpetually surrounded him erupted into a blazing inferno. Golden light poured from him, a visible torrent of sun-bright spiritual energy. Taiyo no Kazuna, he roared, and the power exploded outwards. He drove his Odachi into the ground. It did not create a shockwave of force. It created a shockwave of life. A massive, expanding dome of golden light erupted from him, a perfect hemisphere of pure, existence-affirming energy. When the light hit the silent ones, they were thrown back, their static forms screeching and dissolving at the edges. The creeping gray film on the ground vaporized, the natural colors of the earth and wood returning in the dome's golden glow. The sound-dampening effect vanished, replaced by the hum of Naruto's incredible power. He had created a sanctuary in the heart of the nothingness. The sill and ones pressed against the outside of the dome, their static hands sizzling and dissolving against its golden surface. It was holding. Go. Naruto grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. The strain of maintaining such a massive, conceptual barrier was immense. It won't last forever. Go now. The shock of his action broke the squad's paralysis. Rukia looked at him, his form silhouetted against the golden light. A lone sun holding back an ocean of night. Her heart clenched, but his command echoed in her mind. Your duty is to your squad. Move, she commanded, her voice ringing with newfound authority. She grabbed the catatonic Kosuke, throwing his remaining arm over her shoulder. Ryunosuke, clutching the stump of his broken Zanpakuto, helped another injured officer. They scrambled, hurried flight towards the edge of the village, away from the gray zone. Rukia looked back one last time. Naruto was on one knee now, his teeth gritted, the golden dome flickering. The silent ones were pressing in, their sheer numbers creating cracks in the barrier of light. He was making a choice. He was sacrificing his position, his energy, his own safety, to save them. With a final, heartbroken glance, she turned and used Shunpo, carrying Kosuke away from the battlefield. Inside the faltering dome, Naruto watched them go. He could feel his reserves plummeting. The barrier was conceptual, a manifestation of his very life force pushed against its antithesis. It was like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. Kit, this is a fool's errand, Kurama's voice rumbled in his soul. You cannot fight the ocean. You cannot punch the night sky. I can give them time, Naruto gasped, driving more power into the dome. That's enough. The dome shattered. The silent ones poured in. The sound vanished again. The light snuffed out. Naruto was alone in the gray, surrounded. He swung Taiyo no Kazuna, a golden arc of existence that forced three of the creatures back, their forms flickering. But two more were on him. One from the side, one from behind. He spun, parrying one with his blade, the conceptual impact jarring him to the bone. But the other one, its hand of static touched his back. He didn't feel pain. He felt cold, a deep, profound, soul-deep cold as the point of contact began to unravel. He felt his own existence being questioned, being unmade. The orange fabric of his jacket disappeared. Then the skin and muscle beneath it. He roared, a sound of pure defiance, and flared his spiritual pressure, a localized explosion of golden light that blasted the creature away from him. He stumbled forward, catching himself on one knee. He looked over his shoulder. A hole, the size of a fist, was simply gone from his back, a perfect circle of nothingness carved out of him. The edges weren't bleeding, they were shimmering, the process of erasure still fighting against his innate life force. That's it, Kurama snarled within him. A torrent of raw, furious power flooded Naruto's system. A primal rage against this silent violation. The wound on his back stopped spreading, the edges glowing with a fierce orange-red light as Kurama's energy fought to knit him back together. To reaffirm his existence against the void, Naruto pushed himself to his feet, his breath ragged. He was wounded, drained, and surrounded. But he was alive, and he was angry. He raised his blade, he golden light around it now tinged with the fiery red of Kurama's chakra. He was no longer just a sun. He was a supernova. All right, he growled, a feral grin spreading across his face. Who's next? Rukia and the ragged survivors of the squad stumbled back to the Seraite. Their report, delivered through Ryunosuke's trembling voice in her own stark, factual testimony, sent a tremor of genuine fear through the Gote 13's command structure. An enemy that could not be cut, could not be fought with Kido, an enemy that didn't kill you but erased you. And a weapon, a man, whose power was the only thing that could even affect them. The meeting of the captains this time was not a debate. It was a crisis council. They are an anti-existence, Mayuri Kuretsuchi stated, for once his voice devoid of gleeful curiosity and filled with a kind of academic horror. They do not operate on the principles of reishi manipulation. They operate on a principle of conceptual negation. To fight them is to fight the concept of nothingness itself. And Uzumaki's power is the opposite, Shunsui Kyoraku mused, his usual levity gone. A conceptual affirmation. Light versus the void. He saved my squad. A pale but resolute Yukitake stated from his seat. At the cost of his own safety. He is still out there. We cannot mount a rescue, Soi Fan countered, her face grim. We have no effective countermeasures. To send in more Shinigami would be to send them to their own erasure. We would be feeding the phenomenon. The logic was brutal, but undeniable. They were helpless. As the captains argued, deadlocked by the terrifying new reality, Rukia stood outside the hall, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. She could still see him, a lone figure of gold holding back the gray tide. He had saved them. He had ordered her to leave. And she had obeyed. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than any she had ever carried. Her brother, Byakuya Kuchiki, appeared at her side. He had been silent throughout the meeting, his face an unreadable mask. You followed his orders, he said, his voice as cool and distant as ever. He is one of my division's men. I am his partner. I left him behind, she choked out, the words tasting like ash. You ensured the survival of the rest of your team, Byakuya stated. You brought back invaluable intelligence that has defined the nature of our new enemy. You acted as a seated officer should. There is no dishonor in your actions. There is no honor in leaving a comrade to die. She snapped, her composure finally breaking. She looked up at her brother, her violet eyes swimming with unshed tears of fury and despair. Don't you understand? His power is the only thing that works. We're all sitting here, talking, while he might be gone. Erased. Because he chose to save us. Byakuya looked down at his sister, at the raw, passionate fire in her eyes. It was the same fire he had seen when she had defended the Ryoka boy, Ichigo Kurosaki. The same defiance of protocol in the name of a personal bond. He saw her loyalty, her fierce, protective instinct. And he saw that it was directed at the anomaly, Naruto Uzumaki. He did not offer comfort. He did not offer platitudes. He simply stood there, a silent, unmoving pillar beside her, as she wrestled with her guilt. But for the first time, when he thought of the strange, sun-bright man who was changing his sister so profoundly, the cold calculation in his mind was joined by a flicker of something else. Something that might have been grudging respect. Just as the captains, Miden G was about to dissolve into helpless indecision, a new presence flared at the edge of the Seraite. It was vast, ragged, and utterly furious, but it was unmistakable. It was the golden anomaly. He was back. Every captain felt it. Rukia gasped, her head snapping up, her eyes wide with disbelief and overwhelming relief. He appeared at the main gate, not by Shunpo, but by a staggering, blood-soaked walk. He was covered in filth and dried blood, his orange jacket torn to shreds. A large, angry red patch on his back showed where his wound was furiously healing itself, steaming in the cool air. He was leaning heavily on his zanpakuto, using it as a cane. He looked exhausted, drained to the very core of his being, but he was alive. And he was alone. He had walked out of the heart of the nothingness. He had faced the silent tide and survived. As the guards rushed to help him, he looked up, his blue eyes finding the distant figure of Rukia on the steps of the First Division. He gave her a weak, tired, but triumphant grin. And then he collapsed. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The Cage of Order. The 4th Division barracks had never seen a patient like Naruto Uzumaki. He lay in a private, high-security medical ward, the air thick with the hum of keto-based diagnostic equipment. Captain Unohana herself oversaw his treatment, her usual serene smile replaced by an expression of intense, clinical focus. The wound on his back was the center of a medical enigma. It wasn't a cut, a burn, or a puncture. The diagnostic spells that traced the flow of reishi in a patient's body simply stopped at the edge of the injury. There was no damaged tissue to analyze, because the tissue was no longer there. It had been scooped out of reality, leaving a void that his own formidable life force was now struggling to fill. His healing is extraordinary, Unohana explained to a visiting Captain Yukitaki, her eyes fixed on a glowing green display. A normal soul would have been completely unmade by an injury like this. The erasure would have continued until nothing was left. But his spiritual pressure, or more accurately, the entity fused within his soul, is actively fighting it. It's not just healing, it's reasserting his existence. Rebuilding him from scratch where there was once nothing. It's a battle of concepts happening in his very cells. Yukitaki looked at Naruto's sleeping form, his face pale but peaceful. The sheer tenacity of the man was staggering. Will he make a full recovery? In time, Unohana affirmed. But the scar will remain. Not a physical scar, but a spiritual one. A permain. Nt. Arata. In his soul where the void touched him. I cannot say what long-term effects that might have. She paused, her gaze turning to Yukitaki. The man you brought into our world, Jashiro, he is He only one of us who can stand against this threat. And it almost cost him everything. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. Their greatest weapon was terrifyingly mortal. News of Naruto's survival and the true nature of the Yuru, the name Kazuki Urahara had supplied for the phenomenon in a hurried, encrypted message from the world of the living, meaning simply, the night, and a new kind of shockwave through the Seraite. The initial terror was replaced by a grim, calculated fear. And for Captain Kajiyasu Fumihiro, it was the final, irrefutable proof of his hypothesis. He didn't request a captain's meeting. He went higher. He invoked a prime ministerial decree, a rarely used power afforded to a captain who believed the Gote 13's leadership was failing to address an existential threat. It forced an emergency session of the Central 46. The chamber of the Central 46 was a place of sterile, absolute authority. 46 robed and hooded figures sat in tiered rows, their faces hidden in shadow. Their voices devoid of emotion. They were the lawmakers, the judiciary, the final word in all matters of the Soul Society. To be summoned before them was to be judged by living law itself. Kajiyasu stood alone in the center of the vast, silent room. He was not here as a defendant, but as a prosecutor. His voice, when he spoke, was not filled with passion or fear, but with the cold, irrefutable cadence of a mathematician presenting a proof. Esteemed members of the Central 46, he began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. I stand before you today not to challenge the authority of the Captain Commander, but to save the Soul Society from his sentimentality. We are faced with a conceptual enemy, a force of anti-existence we have dubbed the Yuru. It consumes, it erases, it unmakes. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We have also learned that we possess one, and only one, effective countermeasure, the anomalous soul, Naruto Uzumaki. His power, a conceptual affirmation of existence, can repel the Yuru. This has led some, like Captain Yukitaki, to label him our savior. A champion, a sun to banish the night. He took a slow step forward. I am here to tell you that this conclusion is not only wrong, it is catastrophically dangerous. It mistakes a symptom for a cure. A low murmur went through the assembled sages. Consider the basic laws of our universe. Kujiyasu continued, his voice sharp and clear as glass. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The Gote 13 maintains the balance between worlds by managing the flow of souls. It is a delicate, precise equilibrium. Now, into this perfectly balanced system, we introduce a being of unprecedented spiritual mass. A soul so dense, so potent, that it radiates life force like a star. He is not part of the system. He is a foreign object, a weight placed on one side of a perfectly balanced scale. His argument was building, layer by logical layer. NWH, that is the universe's reaction to such an imbalance. It seeks to correct it. It creates an equal, and opposite, force. The Uru, this anti-existence, is not an ancient evil awakening by chance. It is the universe's immune response. It is the nothing, created to balance the anomalies overwhelming everything. He is not our shield against it, he is the very reason it exists. The logic was terrifying. It was airtight. It reframed Naruto not as a hero, but as a plague bearer, unknowingly attracting the very pestilence he fought. The Arata incidents began shortly after his arrival. Kujiyasu pressed on, his voice ringing with conviction. The Uru's manifestations, the silent ones, are drawn to his power. He is a beacon for them. The battle in the 80th district was not a random attack. It was them attempting to neutralize their conceptual opposite. Every time he uses his power, he shines a brilliant light that only makes the opposing shadow deeper and more defined. To continue to allow him to operate freely is to feed the Uru, to encourage its growth, to invite our own erasure. He stopped, his case laid bare. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Therefore, he concluded, his voice dropping to a low, powerful tone, I petition this body to overrule the Gote 13's command structure. I formally request authorization to use the Koto Amatsukami seal, the 5-point heavenly prison. It is a forbidden seal of the highest order, designed to not merely contain a being, but to place their very soul in a state of suspended animation, removing their spiritual influence from the world entirely. We will place the anomaly in permanent stasis. We will remove the imbalance. And the Uru, with its purpose gone, will recede. He bowed his head. The life of one man, versus the continued existence of all three worlds. The equation is a simple, albeit painful, one. I await your judgment. Rukia paced the length of the 13th Division's infirmary, a small, private room where Naruto had been moved after his initial treatment. He was awake now, sitting up in bed, looking stubbornly frustrated as a 4th Division healer instructed him on the meditative exercises needed to fully mend his spiritual scar. I feel fine, Naruto insisted, for the 10th time. It's just a scratch. Uzumaki-san, with all due respect, you have a hole in your soul, the healer said patiently. A scrat. CH is something Captain Zaraki gives himself while shaving. This requires rest. Rukia wasn't listening. Her mind was on the summons she had received. An order for her to be present at the Central 46 chamber as a witness. Yukataki and Shunsui had been summoned as well. She knew what Kujiyasu was doing. He was making his move. She had visited Naruto every day since his return. They didn't talk about the battle. They didn't need to. Instead, she found herself telling him about her day, complaining about Sentaro and Kion's latest argument, describing the ridiculous drawings she was attempting for a report. And he would listen, a small, constant smile on his face, his presence a warm, reassuring anchor in the storm of fear that was gripping the Seraite. She had stopped seeing him as an anomaly. She saw him as Naruto, her partner, a man who had looked at an unwinnable situation and created a path to survival for his comrades. A man who had grinned at her after walking through hell. The hot of Kujiyasu's cold logic being used to cage that spirit, to extinguish that light, filled her with a cold fury. An officer from the 1st Division appeared at the door. Kuchiki-san, the Central 46 awaits. Naruto's smile faded. He looked at her, his blue eyes serious. What's going on, Rukia? It's Captain Kujiyasu, she said, her voice tight. He's making a case against you. Against me? What? For property damage? He asked, trying to lighten the mood. For existing, she replied grimly. She gave him a firm look. Don't worry. Captain Yukitake and I will handle it. She turned and left, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She felt Naruto's gaze on her back, a silent vote of confidence she prayed she deserved. The atmosphere in the central 46 chamber was even heavier than Kajiyasu had described. Yukitake and Shunsui stood on one side, their faces grim. Kajiyasu stood on the other, a portrait of calm, righteous certainty. Rukia was directed to stand near the center, a key witness in the trial for the soul of her partner. Captain Yukitake, one of the faceless sages intoned, Captain Kajiyasu presents a compelling, logical argument. He posits that the anomaly is the cause of the Uru. He claims your defense of the subject is based on sentiment, not fact. How do you respond? Yukitake stepped forward, his breathing steady. I respond that Captain Kajiyasu's logic is flawless. And his conclusion is dead wrong. The statement sent a ripple through the chamber. Logic is a tool, Yukitake continued, his voice resonating with quiet passion. It can build a house or a gallows with the same precision. Captain Kajiyasu assumes the universe seeks a simple, placid balance. I argue that the universe seeks dynamism. Life itself is an imbalance. It is a struggle against entropy. Against the quiet dark. Naruto Uzumaki is not a disruption. He is an affirmation of life in its most potent form. The Uru is not a response to him. It is an ancient predator that has been drawn from its slumber by the massive spiritual upheavals of our recent wars, Aizen's betrayal, the Quincy invasion. It has come to feed, and Naruto Uzumaki is the only being in existence who can starve it. An elegant theory, Captain, Kajiyasu countered smoothly. But it is just that, a theory. My argument is based on the observable correlation between his arrival and the Uru's manifestation. Correlation is not causation, but it is damning evidence. Can you offer anything more than poetic philosophy? I can, Yukitake said, turning his gaze to Rukia. I can offer the testimony of a direct witness. Rukia Kuchiki, tell this chamber what you saw. Tell them what Naruto Uzumaki did. All eyes, seen and unseen, turned to her. The pressure was immense. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping from the shadowy figures of the 46 to the cold, certain eyes of Kajiyasu. I saw an enemy that our power could not touch, she began, her voice clear and strong. Cutting through the silence, I saw my comrades cut down, erased from existence before they could even draw their blades. I saw terror, and I saw helplessness. I saw the end of us. She then turned her body slightly, to face Kajiyasu directly, and then I saw Naruto Uzumaki make a choice. He did not fight for glory. He did not fight to prove his strength. He used his power to create a sanctuary. He built a wall of light with his own life force and stood between the abyss and my squad. He ordered me to save them, knowing full well it would likely mean his own death. Or worse, his own erasure. Her voice began to rise, imbued with the conviction of her memory. Captain Kajiyasu speaks of equations and balance. But he wasn't there. He did not see the character of the man in the heart of the storm. A weapon does not sacrifice itself for others. A plague does not choose to become a shield. He talks about Naruto's power, but he has no understanding of his will. His will is to protect. It is the most fundamental, foundational aspect of his being. To cage him, to put him in stasis, would not be a strategic decision. It would be a betrayal of the very principle a Shinigami is sworn to uphold, the protection of souls. She was breathless, her heart pounding. She had spoken out of turn, addressed a captain directly, and shown emotion in a chamber that valued sterile logic above all else. She had broken a dozen rules of protocol. A long, heavy silence descended. Then, one of the sages spoke. Your testimony is compelling, Officer Kuchiki, and deeply sentimental. It speaks to the subject's character. But it does not refute Captain Kajiyasu's core premise. The voice was cold, dismissive. Captain Kuchiki, your sister's emotional outburst is noted. As the head of one of the 4 great noble houses and a captain of the Gote 13, your family's honor is intertwined with her conduct. We would hear your opinion on this matter. Is the anomaly a threat to be contained, or a tool to be wielded? The focus of the entire room shifted to the silent, imposing figure of Byakuya Kuchiki. He stood near the edge of the chamber, having been summoned as a senior captain to observe. His face was, as always, An unreadable mask of noble indifference. His gaze was fixed on the floor. Rukia's heart sank. She knew her brother. He was the embodiment of law and order. He would see the logic in Kijasu's argument. He would choose the path that ensured the stability of the Soul Society, regardless of the cost. She had just publicly shamed him with her outburst. Byakuya did not move for a long moment. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Rukia held her breath. Then, slowly, Byakuya raised his head. He did not look at the Central 46. He looked at his sister. He saw the fierce, defiant hope in her eyes. The same look she'd had when she'd stood against her own execution. He saw the woman she had grown into, a woman of principle, loyalty, and surprising strength. He then shifted his gaze to Kijasu, and his eyes were like chips of winter ice. Captain Kijasu's argument is predicated on the idea that the world is a delicate machine, Byakuya said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the chamber. He is a master of Kido and seals. He sees the world in terms of arrays and formulas. It is his nature. He paused, a subtle, powerful oratorical trick. I am a master of the sword. I see the world in terms of blades and the hands that wield them. A blade has no will of its own. Its worth is defined entirely by the character of its master. We have now heard extensive testimony from a reliable officer of the Gote 13, regarding the character of the man who wields this unprecedented power. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. My sister's judgment has, in the past, proven to be more insightful than that of this entire body. She saw the potential in a substitute Shinigami who went on to save us all. Her passionate defense is not a sign of misplaced sentiment. It is a testament to the truth she witnessed. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Kijasu's. The actions of Naruto Uzumaki speak louder than our fears. To imprison a man who has demonstrably acted as a hero, on the basis of a brilliant but unproven theory, is not an act of order. It is an act of cowardice. He finished with a final, cutting statement. My sister's judgment is sound. The motion should be denied. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. The great Byakuya Kuchiki, the ultimate traditionalist, had just sided with the anomaly. He had publicly endorsed his sister's emotional outburst and dismissed Kijasu's logic as fear. It was a political earthquake. Kijasu's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A flicker of disbelief, then cold, sharp fury, crossed his features before he masked it again. He had been outmaneuvered, not by logic, but by an appeal to honor and precedent. The senior sage of the Central 46 rapped his staff once. The testimony of Captain Kuchiki carries great weight. This body requires time to deliberate. But the tide had turned. Byakuya's intervention had given the wavering members of the 46 the political cover. They needed to vote against such an extreme measure. The motion would fail. As the session was suspended, Rukia stared at her brother, her mind reeling. He met her gaze, gave a barely perceptible nod, and then turned and swept from the chamber without another word. He hadn't just saved Naruto. He had validated her. He had stood by her, not as a captain, but as her brother. Later, Rukia found Naruto in the 13th Division's garden. He had discharged himself against medical advice, dressed in a simple black training uniform. He was standing by the koi pond, his back to her. So, did I get detention? He asked without turning around. The motion failed, she said, her voice still trembling slightly with the emotional aftermath of the trial. You're free. He turned, and the playful grin was gone. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. You look exhausted. It was intense, she admitted. I heard you spoke up for me, he said softly. That you put your own reputation on the line. You're my partner, she replied simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I wasn't going to let them lock you in a box. He was silent for a moment, just looking at her. The setting sun cast a golden glow over them, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He took a step closer, and the casual, friendly space between them suddenly felt charged with something else. Rukia, he said, his voice low and serious. Thank you. The words were simple, but they were filled with a profound gratitude that went far beyond the events of the day. He was thanking her for seeing him, the man. Not the weapon or the anomaly. He was thanking her for trusting him. The emotional wall she had so carefully maintained around him, the professional distance of a partner and guide, crumbled into dust. In its place was a connection so deep and palpable it was an almost physical presence. She saw him not just as a comrade, but as someone who understood sacrifice, who saw the best in people, and who had trusted her with his fate without a moment's hesitation. "Just try not to get erased again, idiot," she mumbled, looking away to hide the sudden heat in her cheeks and the shimmering in her eyes. It was the closest she could come to admitting how terrified she had been of losing him. He let out a soft chuckle, a warm and gentle sound. "I'll do my best." The unspoken thing between them was no longer a mystery. It was there, clear as day, a bond forged in battle, trust, and the shared defiance of a world that sought to put them both in a cage. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. Shikai of the Sun, Heart of the Moon. Kageyasu Fumihiro accepted his defeat in the Central 46 chamber with outward grace. He offered a formal, chillingly polite apology to Captain Yukitake for his overzealous pursuit of security, and resumed his duties as captain of the 9th Division. But his conviction had not been swayed. It had been forged into something harder, more dangerous. If the system would allow him to surgically remove the cancer, then he would quarantine it. Citing the continued threat of the Uru and the need for extreme containment protocols, he used his authority, bolstered by a network of sympathizers within the Central 46 who still believed his logic, to establish a Level 1 purification zone around the affected districts in the Rukongai. The official decree was that it was to study the phenomenon. The reality was a death sentence. A cordon of keto barriers, reinforced by the full strength of the 9th Division, was erected, sealing off a massive swath of territory. They weren't just sealing in the Uru. They were sealing in the tens of thousands of souls still living there, trapping them with the creeping, silent nothingness. The news hit the 13th Division like a physical blow. "This is monstrous," Sentaro roared, slamming his fist on a table in the barracks. "He's just leaving them to be erased. He's calling it a necessary sacrifice to gather data on the Uru's progression," Kion added, her voice trembling with rage. "It's a slaughter, and he's calling it an experiment." Rukia stood silently, staring at the map where the new quarantine line was drawn in stark red. She could see the villages, the names of the settlements, the estimated soul counts. They weren't numbers to her. They were faces. They were the woman and child Naruto had saved on his first day. They were the terrified man who had been unmade before her very eyes. Naruto entered the room, his movements no longer stiff from his injury. His face was grim. He had heard. "Yukitake Taiko, what are our orders?" Captain Yukitake, who had been observing the scene, stepped forward. He looked frailer than ever, the political battle having taken a visible toll, but his eyes burned with a righteous fire. "Captain Commander Yamamoto is bound by the Central 46's decision to allow Kageyasu this procedural latitude. Officially, the Gote 13 cannot intervene." A wave of despair washed over the room. However, Yukitake continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, "I am the captain of the 13th Division. And my division is responsible for the protection of all souls, wherever they may be. A clerical error has been made, and a large number of our personnel have been mistakenly dispatched for a high-intensity training exercise inside the quarantine zone." He looked pointedly at Naruto, Rukia, and his senior officers. "Our objective is to open a breach in the Keto barrier, create an evacuation corridor, and get as many souls out as we can before the Uru consumes them. This is a direct violation of a standing order. Everyone who participates will be subject to disciplinary action, including potential imprisonment. No one is required to go." He didn't need to ask for volunteers. Not a single person in the room hesitated. "The 9th Division will not take this lying down," Rukia stated, her mind already working through the tactical challenges. "They will see our mobilization as an act of insurrection. Let them," Naruto said, his voice a low growl. He placed a hand on the hilt of Taiyo no Kazuna. "They can stand with us or they can get out of our way." The mobilization was swift and silent. The 13th Division moved out under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, a wave of black-robed Shinigami flowing through the Seraite towards the massive Keto wall that now scarred the Rukongai. They moved with the grim determination of soldiers on a mission they knew was just, regardless of the consequences. They arrived at the barrier to find the entire 9th Division waiting for them. Captain Kageyasu stood at their head, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold disappointment. Beside him, his lieutenant, Janae, looked pale and nervous. "Captain Yukitake," Kujiyasu called out, his voice amplified by a Kido spell. "Your compassion has finally curdled into treason. Turn your division around. You are violating a direct edict from a sanctioned Central 46 operation. Your operation is a death sentence for thousands, Kujiyasu." Yukitake called back, his voice firm despite his physical weakness. "I will not stand by and watch you sacrifice them on the altar of your paranoia. It is a calculated, necessary measure to ensure the survival of all worlds," Kujiyasu retorted, his voice rising. "You and your pet anomaly are blinded by sentiment. You cannot see the grand equation. These souls are a small price to pay for balance. There is no balance in genocide." Naruto's voice roared, cutting through the tense standoff. He stepped forward, his spiritual pressure flaring, a golden aura of heat and light shimmering around him. "We are Shinigami. We protect souls. It is the first, last, and only rule that matters. Stand down, Kujiyasu, or we will walk through you." The challenge hung in the air, a declaration of war between two divisions of the Gote 13. Kujiyasu's eyes narrowed, his hand moving to his Zanpakuto. The men and women of the 9th and 13th divisions tensed, their own hands going to their blades. The Seraite was on the brink of a civil war. And then, the world went gray. A surge of power, far greater than anything they had witnessed before, erupted from the heart of the quarantine zone. The creeping, desaturated wall of the Yuru's influence exploded outwards, moving not at a crawl, but at the speed of a tidal wave. It washed over the landscape, the very air turning thick and silent, the colors bleeding from reality in a heartbeat. Worse, from the wave of nothingness, hundreds of silent ones materialized. They poured forth, a chaotic, static-filled army of faceless horrors, their presence an overwhelming psychic scream of negation. The standoff was instantly forgotten. The philosophical debate was over. The apocalypse had arrived. "Positions," Kujiyasu yelled, his strategic mind overriding his fury. "9th Division, defensive Kido circle. Hold the line. Do not let them reach the Seraite." His division, trained in the art of seals and barriers, moved with frantic efficiency, attempting to erect walls of light. But the silent ones simply glided through them, the Kido constructs dissolving like mist. 13th Division, engage, Yukitake commanded, before a racking cough bent him double. The two divisions, poised to kill each other only moments before, were forced into a desperate, chaotic alliance. The battle was a nightmare. Shinigami who had faced armies of hollows found themselves utterly helpless. Their Zanpakuto attacks were unmade. Their Kido spells fizzled into nothing. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't touch. An enemy that erased them from existence with a single, silent caress. Screams, choked and horrifying, began to cut through the unnatural silence as Shinigami from both divisions were caught by the silent ones. Their limbs or entire bodies vanishing into eddies of gray static. Rukia was a blur of white and black, her face a mask of fierce concentration. "Some no mai, Tsukishiro," she cried, creating a massive circle of pure white ice to freeze a group of the creatures. For a moment, it worked, their forms encased in frost. But then the ice itself was unmade, sublimating into nothing. And the creatures continued their advance, unharmed. She clicked her tongue in frustration. Her blade was meant to freeze, to bring things to a stop. But how could you stop something that was, by its very nature, a form of cessation? She found herself cornered, three silent ones gliding towards her, their faceless forms seeming to mock her efforts. She braced herself, holding Soda no Shirayuki in a defensive stance. Knowing it was useless, just as the lead creature reached for her, a blur of gold slammed into its side. "Reaffirm, Taiyo no Kazuna." Naruto's voice was a lifeline in the silent chaos. He had unleashed his Shikai, his Odachi glowing with the gentle light of a miniature sun. He swung the blade, not at the creature's body, but at the space it occupied. The effect was bizarre. Where his blade passed, the creature's static form flickered violently. The golden energy of his sword didn't cut it, but it seemed to solidify it, to force the concept of existence upon its anti-existence form. For a split second, the silent one became a tangible thing. And in that second, Rukia's ice could find purchase. "Now, Rukia," he yelled. Understanding dawned. His power made them vulnerable. Her power could hold them in place. She stabbed her blade forward. Tsugi no Mai, Hakuren. A blast of pure, white cold erupted from her sword, slamming into the reaffirmed creature. This time, the ice didn't vanish. It froze the creature solid, its static form locked in a prison of absolute cold. The creature didn't shatter. It simply stood, a frozen statue of nothingness. It works, she cried out, a surge of hope cutting through her fear. They had found a chink in the armor. They fell into a deadly rhythm, a dance of sun and moon. Naruto would move through the battlefield like a golden comet, his blade reaffirming one silent one after another. Rukia would follow in his wake, her precise, elegant ice attacks freezing the creatures he made vulnerable. They were a perfect, two-person engine of containment, a beacon of hope in the swirling chaos of the battle. But they were just two people, and there were hundreds of silent ones. The line was breaking. The combined forces of the 9th and 13th were being overwhelmed. Naruto saw Kageyasu, his face pale, his immaculate uniform torn. The captain of the 9th was using his own Shikai, a complex Zanpakuto that created intricate webs of sealing Kido. But the webs were being unmade as fast as he could create them. He was fighting a brilliant, but ultimately losing, battle. The true crisis came when the Yuru's influence surged again. The ground itself seemed to ripple, and a far larger entity began to coalesce. It was a silent one, but it was easily 50 feet tall, a colossal being of roiling static, its presence so powerful. It caused the very air to warp around it. It was a Manos-class version of their new enemy. It raised a massive, static-filled hand and brought it down on a group of cowering 9th Division officers. Naruto saw it. He knew he wouldn't make it in time. With a roar, he channeled a massive amount of power into his blade. Taiyo no Getsuga, he swung his Odachi, releasing a colossal wave of pure golden, existence-affirming energy. It wasn't designed to cut, but to reinforce. The wave slammed into the ground in front of the cowering Shinigami, and the very earth shone with a golden light. The colossal creature's hand struck the reaffirmed ground, and for the first time, there was an impact. A massive boom echoed across the battlefield as anti-existence met reinforced existence. The creature's hand didn't erase the ground. It was repelled, its own form flickering violently from the impact. Naruto had saved them, but the effort had cost him. He was panting, his reserves draining at an alarming rate. He had reaffirmed a small section of the battlefield, but the rest of the silent army was still advancing. He saw Rukia, her face grim, using her ice to create walls, to buy seconds for fleeing Shinigami. He saw her bravery, her refusal to give in to despair, and something inside him, a fierce, protective instinct that had defined his entire life, roared to the surface. In the exhausted aftermath of his massive attack, as the battle raged around them, he and Rukia found themselves momentarily back to back in the heart of the storm. They were both breathing heavily, their bodies bruised and battered. "There are too many," she said, her voice strained. "We can't hold them. We have to," he gasped, his eyes scanning the chaos. He looked at her, at the smudges of dirt on her cheek, fierce determination in her violet eyes, the lock of dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. In that moment of shared desperation, surrounded by an enemy that represented the end of everything. The pretense that had existed between them, the carefully maintained distance, felt like a hollow, meaningless thing. The deep respect, the fierce loyalty, the unspoken affection, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. He was bleeding from a dozen minor scrapes. His spiritual energy was at a critical low. But as he looked at her, none of that mattered. "You were brilliant," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the silent hum of the Yuru. It wasn't a compliment on his power. It was an acknowledgement of his spirit, his selflessness, his unyielding will. Her composure, the Kuchiki pride she wore like armor, had finally cracked, revealing the genuine awe and affection beneath. He looked at her, his usual easy-going grin gone, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded sincerity. The world could be ending around them, but in that moment, she was his entire focus. "Only because I had to keep you safe," he said, his voice husky with exhaustion and emotion. It wasn't a confession spoken in a quiet garden. It was a truth revealed in the heart of a losing battle, and it was all the more powerful for it. The unspoken love between them was no longer a gentle undercurrent. It was a brilliant, shimmering presence, a singular point of light and warmth in a universe that was rapidly turning cold and gray. Her breath caught in her throat. His name was a silent word on her lips. A sudden, sharp cry of pain snapped them back to reality. Kujiyasu. He had been caught. A silent one had slipped past his defenses, its hand grasping his arm. The sleeve of his captain's haori and the arm beneath it began to shimmer. To unexist. A look of pure, primal terror crossed his face as he felt the fundamental laws of his own being coming undone. Without a second thought, Naruto was moving. He appeared at Kujiyasu's side in a golden flash, his blade severing the silent one's arm, or rather, reaffirming the space between its arm and torso so that it detached. The creature recoiled, and Naruto kicked it away. He then grabbed Kujiyasu, dragging him back. "Are you all right?" Kujiyasu stared at his arm. The process of erasure had stopped, but a shimmering, static wound remained, a permanent mark of the void. He looked from his wound to Naruto, the man he had tried to imprison, the anomaly who had just saved his life. His face was a maelstrom of confusion, humiliation, and a dawning, horrified understanding. "Why?" Kujiyasu choked out. I tried to. "We can talk about it later," Naruto grunted, pushing Kujiyasu towards the retreating line of Shinigami. "Right now, we're on the same side." He turned back to face the tide, Rukia instantly appearing at his side, her presence a silent promise of support. They stood together, the sun and the moon, a lone bastion of defiance. Their combined light a fragile but stubborn flame against the encroaching, absolute night. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. A Day in Karakura Town. The retreat was a ragged, brutal affair. Naruto, his power a flickering beacon, created a fighting corridor, a path of reaffirmed reality through the sea of nothingness. He and Rukia acted as the rear guard, a whirlwind of gold and white, sun and ice, Lding back the tide of silent ones just long enough for the battered remnants of the 9th and 13th divisions to drag their wounded back behind the protective walls of the Seraite. The Kido barrier Kujiyasu had erected was repurposed, reinforced by every Kido master available, becoming not a cage, but a desperate, last-ditch shield. The cost had been staggering. Dozens of Shinigami were dead, erased. More were wounded, carrying the shimmering, static scars of the Yuru's touch, wounds that Captain Unohana admitted she had no idea how to treat. Kujiyasu was among them, sequestered in his division, refusing to be seen. The man of perfect order now permanently marked by the very chaos he sought to contain. The Seraite was in a state of quiet panic. They had an enemy that could not be fought by conventional means in a single, solitary soldier who could stand against it, a soldier who was powerful but finite. They needed a new approach, a way to think outside the rigid doctrines of the Gote 13. It was Captain Yukitake, recovering from the strain of the battle, who made the call. "We need a mind that doesn't play by our rules," he said, his voice raspy but firm, during a strategy session with Naruto and Rukia. "We need someone who delights in breaking the system to see how it works. We need Urahara Kazuki." And so, 2 days later, Naruto and Rukia found themselves standing in the cluttered, chaotic confines of the Urahara Shoten in the world of the living. They were in Gigai, temporary artificial bodies, and the transition was jarring. For Rukia, it was a familiar discomfort. For Naruto, it was a brand new, bizarre sensation. "Everything feels numb," he said, flexing his fingers. He was dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, an outfit Tessai had provided. It felt strange, after a lifetime in ninja garb and a brief stint in Shinigami robes. "And I can't feel anyone's spiritual pressure. It's like being half-deaf." "You'll get used to it," Rukia said. She was in a modest floral dress, looking more like a local university student than a seasoned warrior. An odd sense of nostalgia washed over her, memories of her time with Ichigo, of navigating this strange, vibrant world. Seeing it now, with Naruto, felt different, less like an assignment, more like sharing a piece of her own history. Kazuki Urahara, clad in his signature green and white striped bucket hat and wooden geta, fanned himself as he listened to their report. His usual lazy, cheerful demeanor was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He had already received a preliminary report via his strange communication device. But hearing the first-hand accounts was different. Yoruichi Shihoin, in her black cat form, sat silently on a counter, her golden eyes fixed on Naruto. A conceptual entity of pure negation, Urahara mused, tapping his fan against his chin. Fascinating. And terrifying. It's not a hollow, which is a corrupted soul, nor a Quincy, who manipulates ambient reishi. It predates all of that. It's a primordial force. The universe's delete button, you could say. He looked at Naruto, his gaze intense. And you, Uzumaki-san, are the undo command. Your soul, fused with this, Kurama, doesn't just generate Raryoku. It generates existence itself, a fundamental byproduct of your life force. That's why you can reaffirm things the Euro tries to erase. You're not just fighting it, you're rewriting its edits. Can you help us find a way to fight it? A weapon, a Kido, anything. Rukia pressed. A weapon to fight nothingness, Urahara chuckled, a grim sound. That's a tall order. It's like trying to build a sword to kill a shadow. You don't kill a shadow by hitting it, you get rid of it by turning on a light. He looked at Naruto again. And he's the only light we've got. The question isn't how to build a better sword, but how to make his light brighter, or how to build more lamps. He stood up and began to pace. I need data. I need to see this phenomenon for myself. I've detected minor spiritual tremors here in Karakura town, echoes of the Yuru's surge in the Soul Society. Faint pockets of negation static. It suggests the membrane between worlds is becoming porous to this threat. If we can find one of these pockets, I might be able to analyze its properties. Then let's go, Naruto said, his decisiveness cutting through Urahara's theoretical rambling. Excellent. Urahara clapped his hands. A little field trip. It'll be a nice change of scenery for you both. See the sights. Enjoy the modern world. The field trip was, for Naruto, a sensory overload. The sheer number of people, the roar of cars, the towering buildings of glass and steel, it was a world away from the feudal landscape of his home and the traditional Japanese aesthetic of the seraite. He looked at everything with the wide-eyed wonder of a child. What is that? He asked, pointing at a massive television screen mounted on the side of a building, displaying a flashy commercial for a soft drink. That's a television, Rukia explained, a small, exasperated sigh escaping her lips. It shows moving pictures, like a photograph that doesn't stay still. That's incredible. He found herself in the unexpected role of tour guide, explaining the function of cell phones, traffic lights, and vending machines. Her usual stern demeanor softened, replaced by a fond annoyance. There was something endearing about his genuine curiosity, his complete lack of pretension. He wasn't a godlike anomaly here, he was just a man out of time, fascinated by a world he didn't understand. Their walk was interrupted by the smell of roasting pork and savory broth. Naruto stopped, his nose twitching. What is that amazing smell? Rukia followed his gaze to a small, bustling ramen stand. A pang of nostalgia hit her again. It's ramen. Ramen. His eyes lit up with a fervent, almost religious zeal that took her completely by surprise. You have ramen here. Is it good? We have to try it. Minutes later, they were sitting side by side at the counter, two steaming bowls of tonkatsu ramen between them. Rukia watched, bemused, as Naruto took his first bite. His eyes closed in bliss. Oh, this is good. He mumbled through a mouthful of noodles. Different from Ichiraku's, but, wow. They ate in a comfortable silence. For a few minutes, they weren't soldiers facing an existential threat. They were just two people sharing a meal. Rukia found herself watching him, the way he attacked his food with such gusto, the small, happy smile on his face. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot broth. It was a simple, domestic moment, a fragile bubble of peace in the middle of a war, and she found she wanted to protect it as fiercely as she would protect the seraite itself. You seem to know your way around here, Naruto commented, gesturing vaguely with his chopsticks. You've spent time in this town before. I have, she said, her gaze distant for a moment. I was stationed here for a while. It's complicated. He didn't press. He just nodded, accepting her privacy. That was another thing she was coming to appreciate about him. He never pushed, never pried. He waited for you to share what you were willing to. It made her want to share more. As they finished, a device in Rukia's pocket, a modified cell phone from Urahara, began to beep. A map appeared on its screen. A single red dot pulsing in an industrial area near the city's port. Urahara found one, she said, her professional tone returning. A pocket of Uru energy. The bubble of peace burst. It was time to get back to work. The port was a desolate landscape of shipping containers and abandoned warehouses, the salty air thick with the smell of rust and decay. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows that made the stacks of containers look like sleeping metal giants. Urahara's device led them to a large, derelict warehouse, its windows broken in. Its corrugated metal walls stained with grime. The energy signature is coming from inside, Rukia said, her hand instinctively moving to where the hilt of her Zanpakuto would be, only to find empty air. The feeling of helplessness was unnerving. Stay sharp, Naruto said, his own posture shifting from relaxed tourist to alert warrior. Even in a Gigai, his instincts were razor sharp. They slid open the large, groaning metal door and stepped inside. The warehouse was vast and dark, the only light coming from dusty skylights far above. And in the center of the cavernous space, the air shimmered. It was a small patch of the negation static, a roiling ball of gray and black particles about the size of a man, hovering a few feet off the ground. It was smaller and less potent than the manifestations in the Soul Society. But it was unmistakably the same phenomenon. It leached the color from the concrete floor beneath it and muffled the sounds of their entry. There it is, Rukia whispered. It's contained. No, a voice drawled from the shadows. It's being controlled. From behind a stack of crates, a figure emerged. He was tall and lean, dressed in the tattered white remains of an Irankar's uniform. His skin was pale, and a fragment of a jawbone-like mask clung to the side of his face. The hollow hole in his chest was jagged, but what was truly horrifying was his left arm. From the shoulder down, it wasn't flesh. It was a seamless extension of the Uru's static, a limb made of pure, shimmering anti-existence. He was a fusion of two distinct forms of spiritual being, a horrifying hybrid. Rukia recognized him. Talon, she breathed. One of Neutra's Fracken. We thought you were killed during the Winter War. The Irankar, Talon, gave a cruel smirk. Death is for lesser beings, Shinigami. I found something better, something stronger. The masters Aizen and Tosen spoke of are nothing compared to the power of the void. It found me, broken and dying, and it made me whole again. He flexed his static arm, and the ball of Uru energy in the center of the room pulsed in response. It gave me a power you can't even comprehend. You're a fool, Naruto said, his voice cold. You haven't mastered anything. You're just a parasite clinging to a bigger parasite. That thing is consuming you. Talon's smirk twisted into a snarl. I have a power that can erase my enemies from existence. I am a god compared to you. He pointed his static arm at a stack of steel barrels across the room. The air crackled, and a familiar crimson light began to gather at his fingertips, but it was mottled with streaks of gray static. Sero, Ascuras, he began to chant, but he was fusing it with the Uru's power. Sero, Exterminar, he fired. It wasn't the usual blast of energy. It was a beam of pure blackness, threaded with gray static. It didn't explode on impact. Where it struck the barrels, they simply vanished. Erased, leaving a perfect, cylindrical hole through the thick steel as if it had never been there. This changes things, Naruto said grimly. The Uru isn't just a mindless force. It can corrupt. It can empower. My turn, Talon sneered, aiming his arm at them. Naruto moved. He shoved Rukia behind him and charged, not at Talon, but towards the side. He was drawing the fire, using his speed to make himself a difficult target. The warehouse became a death trap, as Alon fired one erasing Sero after another. Beams of nothingness sliced through the air, carving silent holes in concrete pillars and stacks of crates. You can't fight him in a Gigai, Rukia yelled, her mind racing. They were physically limited, their spiritual powers sealed. Naruto skidded behind a massive piece of industrial machinery, a Sero Exterminar erasing the spot where he had been a second before. Got any ideas? He yelled back. Rukia looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on a fire control system on the wall, a large, red lever. An idea, desperate and reckless, formed in her mind. The ceiling, the sprinkler system. Buy me 10 seconds. Naruto didn't question it. He burst from cover, running in an erratic pattern, drawing Talon's attention. Hey, ugly, your aim is terrible, Talon roared in frustration, firing blast after blast. While he was distracted, Rukia sprinted to the wall and threw her entire weight onto the lever. With a groan of rusted metal, she pulled it down. Alarms blared. High above, the industrial sprinkler system shuddered to life. Torrents of cold, dirty water began to rain down across the entire warehouse. Talon shielded his face, momentarily confused. What is this? A little water won't stop me. It's not about stopping you, Rukia said, a grim smile on her face. It's about giving us a weapon. Naruto, drenched in water, grinned. He understood instantly. He clapped his hands together, his knuckles turning white. It's been a while since I've done this without Sage Mode. He began gathering the trace amounts of natural energy in the water-soaked air. In the very concrete beneath his feet. It was a struggle in the Gigai, like trying to breathe through a wet cloth, but it was possible. A faint, almost invisible aura of natural energy began to coalesce around him. Talon, realizing something was wrong, aimed at Naruto. Die. Just as he was about to fire, a small, white pill shot out from the shadows near the entrance and struck him in the back of the neck. It was a soul candy, a mod soul pill, but Urahara had likely altered it. Talon froze, his body convulsing as the artificial soul fought for control of his Gigai-like body. It was only for a second, but it was the opening they needed. Naruto's hands flew through a series of complex hand signs, a blur of motion. It was a technique from his past, one he hadn't used in decades. He gathered the natural energy, mixing it with the water covering his hands. Sweden. Tepidama. Water release. Gunshot. He brought his hand to his mouth and spat. It wasn't a massive dragon or a tidal wave. It was a single, compressed, cannonball-like sphere of water. But this water was imbued with the life-affirming energy of nature itself. It was the antithesis of the Uru. The water bullet struck Talon's static arm. The impact was explosive. The nature-infused water reacted violently with the anti-existence energy. There was a sound like 1,000 shattering mirrors as the Uru's power was forcefully, violently negated. Talon screamed, a sound of pure agony, as his entire left arm was blown apart in a shower of steaming water and dissipating gray static. He staggered back, clutching the smoking stump of his shoulder. His face a mask of shock and pain. He stared at Naruto, at the faint aura of natural energy now fading around him. Nature energy, he whispered in horror. You can command it, even in this world. He knew he was beaten. With a snarl, he ripped a garganta open behind him and stumbled through it, retreating back to whatever dark corner of Hueco Mundo he had crawled from. The warehouse fell silent, the only sound the steady drumming of the sprinklers. Naruto stood panting, the effort of gathering even a small amount of nature energy in the Gigai having taken a toll. Rukia ran to his side. Are you all right? That was an old trick, he said, managing a tired smile. He looked down at his hands, then at the spot where Talon had vanished. But it tells us something new. This Uru, it's not just weak to my soul's energy. It's weak to life itself. Pure, natural energy, the kind that flows through this world. Urahara and Yoruichi emerged from the shadows, Urahara already collecting samples from the spot where the Sero had hit. My, the shopkeeper said, his fan hiding a grin. It seems our little field trip was more productive than I imagined. The why. Oru can corrupt existing spiritual beings, and its power can be negated by natural energy. This complicates things, and opens up a world of new possibilities. Later, as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Naruto and Rukia stood on the boardwalk of the port, looking out at the calm ocean. The rain had stopped. The air was clean and cool. You're full of surprises, Naruto Uzumaki. Rukia said softly, breaking the silence. You too, he replied, looking at her. That plan with the sprinklers was brilliant. Quick thinking. A comfortable silence fell between them. The day had been a chaotic mix of silly tourism and a life-or-death battle. They had seen each other in different lights, as a warrior, a guide, a wide-eyed tourist, a brilliant strategist. Each new facet only seemed to deepen the connection between them. This world, it's so loud and chaotic, Naruto mused, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle across the bay. But it's beautiful. Full of life. Yes, Rukia agreed, her gaze soft. It is. He took her hand. It felt natural, right? His thumb gently stroked her knuckles. Her fingers curled instinctively around his. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of quiet solidarity, a simple, profound statement in the face of an overwhelming threat. No matter what this thing is, she said, her voice firm with a newfound resolve. No matter how it evolves or who it corrupts, we'll face it. Together. He squeezed her hand, his blue eyes meeting her violet ones in the twilight. The promise was sealed in that look, a silent vow that transcended worlds and lifetimes. Always, he said. Chapter 6 End.